it's afternoon on the 14th of November 2004. The USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group is undergoing a series of intensive drills and training in preparation for deployment to the Persian Gulf. Along with the Nimitz, the strike group includes Destroyer Squadron 9, made up of 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 2 guided missile cruisers, and at least 1 nuclear attack submarine constantly prowling the waters beneath the warships. Altogether, with the Nimitz's air wing, this single carrier strike group represents one of the greatest concentrations of firepower on Earth, and soon it'll come face to face with something possibly not of this planet. 2 weeks before the fateful day, the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser USS Princeton was receiving odd tracks on its ANSPY 1B radar. Initially, a radar operator spotted a formation of 8 to 10 objects flying in formation southward along the American Pacific coast at about 28,000 feet. The objects moved extremely slowly at about 120 miles per hour, which was rather shocking as most aircraft must move faster than that to avoid stalling out. Immediately, the Princeton requested confirmation from accompanying vessels on the unidentified objects. As the backbone of fleet anti-missile and anti-air defense, Ticonderoga missile cruisers operate the most sophisticated radar on the planet, and the Princeton's radar contact with the unknown objects was confirmed by several other vessels. An E-2C Hawkeye electronics warfare plane from the USS Nimitz also confirmed a weak radar return on the unknown formation of objects. The objects disappear from radar after continuing their slow flight, moving out of range of the battle group's sensors. Despite the odd radar contacts, no interceptors are dispatched in pursuit of the objects, and they're largely forgotten. Until suddenly, dozens of unknown contacts begin appearing on the Princeton's radar screens. Over the course of a week, senior radar operator Kevin Day records over 100 radar contacts, with some of them well over 80,000 feet above the battle group, well out of the altitude of commercial and most military jets. These objects would often plummet out of the sky at incredible speed and eventually completely disappear out of sight. As the objects don't appear to be threatening the battle group, however, no action is taken against them until that fateful November 14th. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets are currently in a combat exercise, prepping for the deployment to the Persian Gulf. In 2004, the Super Hornet is the world's most feared fighter aircraft, a true marvel of engineering that strikes fear in the hearts of any pilot pit against it. Blisteringly fast and extremely agile, the Super Hornet is the Navy's tool for dominating the air battle over any ocean on Earth. Today, though, the Hornets will meet their match with a craft possibly not from the Earth. The Princeton once more detects an unknown track on their highly sensitive radar. After being plagued with contacts for the last 2 weeks, the strike group's commander authorizes an intercept, and the 2 Hornets are contacted and told to prepare for a real-world mission. The pilots immediately break off from their exercise and change course, headed directly for the unknown object still being actively tracked. As the fighters close in on the object, the Princeton radios over and asks if the aircraft are carrying live ordnance. Unfortunately, no, the pilots respond. They are only carrying dummy training missiles and no rounds in their cannons. Unarmed, the 2 fighters close in on the unknown contact, on a mission to at least identify and hopefully chase off this mysterious intruder. The pilots close the distance to the object, and as they approach, they notice a large shape below the waters and disturbing the ocean's surface, as if a huge object about the size of a Boeing 747 was right below the waves. Flying about 50 feet above the underwater object was a smaller tic-tac shaped object that appeared to have no wings, no exhaust, and no windows of any kind. The object seemed to ignore the incoming aircraft until the lead Hornet started a slow circular descent toward it. The object immediately mirrored the Hornet's descent, but in opposite, starting a slow circular ascent in a reverse looping motion. This is when the lead Hornet decided that it would attempt an aggressive interception and immediately pitched toward the object. In response, the apparent UFO immediately accelerated, flying out of sight in seconds. The Princeton contacted the Hornets and reported that they'd tracked the object reappearing 60 miles from them. Based on distance covered, this means that the object would have had to move at about 42,000 miles per hour to cover such a great distance so quickly. Any earthbound aircraft would have obliterated itself due to intense atmospheric heating, not to mention the incredible acceleration resulting in thousands of Gs would have turned human pilots into pancakes. 2 new Hornets were vectored in on the object's location, but by the time they arrived, it had already disappeared. Disappointed, all 4 Hornets returned to the Nimitz, but as they came in for landing, the carrier launched another patrol of Hornets, this time armed and equipped with infrared tracking and targeting pods. These powerful sensors could detect aircraft from tens of miles away via their infrared signature, and in the clear blue skies of that fateful afternoon, if there was anything in that sky, human or alien, they would find it. The pilots wouldn't have to wait long. After once more making radar contact with the UFO, the Princeton directed the Hornets to the object, and within minutes, they were within visual range. Utilizing the powerful FLIR pod, the weapons officer on the lead Hornet was able to identify and track the tic-tac-shaped UFO in both visual and infrared mode. This meant that the object couldn't possibly be a sensor malfunction, as the object not only showed in two different vision modes, but the infrared mode clearly detected the infrared signature of atmospheric heating working on the skin of the object. What was most perplexing perhaps was the fact that the object displayed no obvious propulsion system or lifting element of any kind, such as wings. How it flew was a complete mystery. In TV mode, the object was extremely dark against the bright daytime sky, which likely meant that the UFO was colored black or another dark color. This would preclude the object being any known drone operational at the time, as the U.S. Air Force and Navy both operate drones which are painted light blue or white, with their job being to loiter above hostile areas for a long time at an altitude low enough that they could potentially be spotted by an observer on the ground. Drones need to be lightly colored in order to avoid being seen. Whatever the object was, nobody appeared to believe it belonged to the U.S. military. Yet before the Hornets could move in closer, it suddenly accelerated and disappeared out of view of the sensor. Since that fateful day, multiple explanations have been offered for the UFOs encountered by the Nimitz battle group. Yet the fact that the object was clearly detected on radar and then visually spotted on both TV and infrared modes rules out any potential equipment malfunctions creating artificial objects, unless some unknown deficiency in America's most important weapon systems is able to simultaneously create errors on a guided missile cruiser's radar and the infrared targeting pod of a Super Hornet. In that case, the US may have bigger problems on its hand than UFOs. The object spotted by the first flight of Hornets cruising just below the depths could very well have been the nuclear attack submarine that accompanies carrier battle groups, and as these subs operate in extreme secrecy, the Hornets would likely have had no idea as to its whereabouts. As to an explanation for the seeming super burst of speed exhibited by the craft at the end of the video, well, this could too be explained by the pursuing Hornet simply banking to the right and away from the object, out of the field of view of the FLIR system. Yet, we can't deny that the visual identification of a UFO, along with radar confirmation, is extremely compelling, and in the end, we simply can't rule out aliens from Zeti Reticuli coming to Earth to feast on our brains. So, is the Earth really being visited by an advanced alien being? Well, it's not likely, and if they are, then they're officially the most boring and confusing alien invaders ever. It just seems strange to us here at the Infographic Show that aliens would cross vast cosmos of space just to play tag with a bunch of our primitive aircraft. Surely they'd want to, talk to our leaders? Yet there remains the fact that the footage has in no way become officially debunked and is extremely compelling. One curious item is a comment made by a CIA official many years ago saying, "I love UFOs because every time that a Chinese or Russian pilot is pointing at the sky and saying, 'UFO, UFO,' he's not saying American aircraft." The mystery would only deepen when another video was released in 2015 showing US pilots intercepting and tracking yet another strangely tic-tac-shaped object. This time the contact is brief and the object appears to be flying at extremely low altitude, though its exact nature remains unknown. The year is 1976. An Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter jet engages an unidentified flying object. The UFO is projecting multicolored strobe lights when suddenly it releases an object that shoots toward the Iranian pilots. The pilot gets a lock on the object, but before it can be destroyed, the plane's weapons and communication systems go down. The pilot takes immediate evasive actions. Fast forward to the 2000s, Iranian F-14 Tomcats engage another UFO. This time there are casualties. The UFO evades the fighter jets and flies out of the atmosphere at Mach 10. It would seem that Iran and UFOs have an interesting history together. When you hear stories of unidentified flying objects, you may imagine a flying saucer or little green aliens. Not only that, but the person who's giving the account seems to always be someone who's not quite all there. They tend to have their crazy hair and wild eyes, but the UFO accounts from Iran are detailed and provided by respected military personnel. The information comes from the eyewitness accounts and classified documents that have been leaked to the public. The first contact between a UFO and the Iranian military occurred in 1976 above the city of Tehran. It was a cool desert night. There were no clouds in the sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like an oasis in a black desert. The sound of shopkeepers closing up their stalls for the night filled the air. Then, suddenly, the skies over Tehran lit up. It was just after midnight on September 19th. Tehran residents began telephoning the local airport, frantically relaying the same message. They were seeing bright lights in the sky. The lights seemed to hover in place and then move rapidly to a different location. It was as if the lights were looking for something or someone. The military and airport personnel checked the radar, but nothing showed up. General Yousefi, the man in charge of the airfield, stepped outside and looked up at the sky. Sure enough, he saw the bright lights for himself. He witnessed the lights jetting across the sky. They looked like shooting stars being controlled by some unseen entity. He scrambled back into the airport and found his best pilots to investigate further. General Yousefi ordered Lieutenant Yadi Nazari and a backseat weapons officer to take off and have a look at the object in the sky. It was time to get up close and personal. The F-4 Phantom fighter plane took off at 1:30 a.m. and leveled off at the altitude of the unidentified object. Upon approach, the F-4 lost all navigational instruments and communications. The dials and screens in the aircraft went haywire. Nazari was flying only using his instincts and what he could see. He kept his eyes on the UFO and his aircraft pointed at the horizon. Nazari made the decision it was too dangerous to continue this way and was forced to turn around and return to base. As soon as the plane began moving away from the UFO, the instruments came back online. It was as if the UFO had some sort of electronics jammer. A second F-4 Phantom was launched at 1:40 a.m., piloted by Lieutenant Parvez Jafari. He approached the UFO and acquired a radar lock. This meant that there was definitely something tangible in the sky. The UFO was a solid mass that reflected the radar and therefore couldn't have been ball lightning or any form of pure energy. Upon getting closer to the UFO, Jafari reported that its lights were alternating in color from blue, green, red, and orange. They were strobing so quickly that they almost appeared to be solid. The UFO began to move south and Jafari pursued the vessel. All of a sudden, the UFO stopped in mid-air. It just sat there unmoving, as if the law of gravity was a force that it could choose to obey or not. Jafari veered around and stopped the aircraft so he wouldn't collide with it. He turned his jet back around and headed back toward the unidentified vessel at a slower speed. On the return approach by Jafari, something even stranger happened. The UFO dropped a bright object out from its main hull. Jafari reported that the object was headed straight for him and his F-4 Phantom, and it looked like a torpedo made of light. He attempted to lock onto the incoming projectile with his AIM-9 Sidewinder infrared-guided missiles, but just after getting a lock, he lost all communications with his weapons console. Jafari was forced to take evasive actions and turn away from the projectile. He jammed the flight stick to the side. The F-4 did a barrel roll and avoided the incoming object. Jafari leveled off again, and when he turned back to look for the object shot at him, Jafari said he saw the device reverse course and rejoin the main UFO. It then seemed to dock with the mothership. Jafari then witnessed another bright object coming out of the main UFO and descending straight down toward the ground. It left a bright trail of light as it descended. The ambient light lit up an area of around 3 kilometers. Then, as if it were done with its business it came to Iran to conduct, the UFO accelerated and shot out of the atmosphere. Jafari watched as the strobing lights faded into the night sky. As the F-4 Phantom prepared to land, it experienced more communication and navigational failures. Upon further investigation, a commercial airliner in the area also reported communication failures at the same time as Jafari, but the airliner did not see the UFO. Ground troops were sent to recover the fallen object, but as they approached the area, their equipment started to malfunction. No trace of whatever the UFO shot toward the ground was ever found, as far as we know. Approximately 3 decades went by without any reports from Iran about UFOs in their airspace. Then, in 2004, strange aircraft were once again encountered by the Iranian Air Force. At this time, Iran was still using a few F-14 Tomcats that they'd purchased from America before the revolution. The Iranian military used the Tomcats to protect their nuclear facilities. Considered one of the most successful fighter jets ever built, its speed, maneuverability, and weapon capabilities make it an aircraft to be feared and respected. The encounter in 2004 went something like this. An alarm was raised when the unidentified flying object was picked up on radar. The UFO entered the airspace above one of Iran's nuclear facilities. Fighter pilots ran to their jets. Mechanics shouted at one another as they prepared planes for takeoff. The pilots were secured in the cockpits by the support crew and the hatch was sealed. The only contact with the outside world was through their helmet. Pure oxygen was being pumped into the face mask to keep them alert. Over their comms, head military personnel were barking orders. An attack on our nuclear facilities could be incoming. We need planes in the air now, the commander shouted. The Iranian pilots flickered the afterburner switch on the engine controls. The F-14 Tomcats accelerated off the runway and into the black sky as flames shot out of the back of their jet engines. As they reached Mach 2, the sonic booms could be heard throughout the desert below. The Iranian military launched 8 F-14s, 8 F-4 Phantoms, and 2 large reconnaissance aircraft to intercept the UFO. The task force encountered objects that they'd claimed had astonishing flight characteristics. One of the F-14 Tomcats tried to lock on to the brightly shining objects, only to have his radar disrupted. The pilot who was tracking the object described it as being spherical and having a green afterburn. It was recorded that whatever engines were producing the green aura were leaving considerable amounts of turbulence behind them. It was like flying through a lightning storm. The plane shook and convulsed uncontrollably. The task force swung out of the turbulent wake of the UFO and tried to flank it from the sides. Before they could get into position, the spherical object shot off like a comet, leaving a tail of green light behind as it exited the atmosphere. The eerie glow was ingrained into the minds of the pilots who were in the task force that day. The Iranian Air Force remained on high alert for any further UFO activity after the 2004 event. Then, in 2012, another strange phenomena occurred. A UFO was spotted in Iranian airspace. It did not show up on radar at first, but then all of a sudden a blip appeared. It was like the ship was cloaked and had just appeared out of thin air. The military scrambled to the F-14s and pursued the vessel, but then tragedy struck. As one of the F-14s took off, it exploded in midair. The aircraft was consumed in a fireball. The smoldering metal fell from the sky and landed in the sands below. Some accounts claim that the UFO attacked the F-14 right after it took off, perhaps using laser beams or a highly advanced weapon that ignited the fuel in the plane's tanks. Both of the crewmen in the plane were killed instantly. Reports by the Iranian government seem to suggest that the UFO had something to do with the mishap, but it's unclear the role the unidentified aircraft played in the catastrophe. Other F-14s flew after the unidentified object. Every time they tried to get a lock on the UFO, their armament systems would malfunction. The dull green light of their screens would appear to be working perfectly one moment, and as soon as a lock was achieved, everything went black. The pilots would try rebooting the systems mid-flight, but nothing seemed to work. The UFO quickly outpaced the F-14 Tomcats as it reached Mach 10, a speed faster than any aircraft currently produced can fly. It was almost like the UFO was toying with the F-14s. With the afterburners, the Tomcats pursued their enemy at a top speed of just over Mach 2. This is 1,534 miles per hour. The encounter ended similarly to the one in 2004. The UFO shot out of the atmosphere with a glowing tail of exhaust behind it. Each of the unexplained encounters recorded incredible capabilities of the UFOs. In all three cases, radar was jammed and weapon systems malfunctioned when the UFO was present. It seems that once the UFO left the general area, the instruments started to work properly again. You have to wonder what whoever was controlling the UFO was after. Their radar jamming capabilities seem highly sophisticated, yet they still allowed the Iranian military to know that they were there. Was it an accident all three times? Or was the UFO testing Iran's Air Force capabilities? Another common factor between the encounters was that the UFOs all left the atmosphere after encountering the Iranian aircraft. They seemed to launch away at Mach 10, which is 10 times the speed of sound, or 7,612 miles per hour. The closest any known human aircraft has gotten to that speed was Mach 9.68. This was achieved by a NASA experimental hypersonic aircraft called the X-43. And why did they shoot out the atmosphere instead of just leaving Iranian airspace? Was there some other vessel waiting for them in orbit around the Earth? Was there a large mothership waiting to launch to light speed once the reconnaissance ships returned? All of the accounts also mention the UFO hovering, which means that they could remain in the air with a velocity of 0. The massive acceleration it would take to go from 0 to Mach 10 in seconds is not possible with our current technology. All of the UFOs were also described as luminous objects. They emitted some kind of light, whether it was the strobes from '76 or the green afterburn glow of the 2000s. Could the lights be some sort of undiscovered propulsion from an advanced alien race? Or is there a country on Earth that's discovered an advanced propulsion system that the public is unaware of? There are several theories as to what the UFOs might have been. Iran has claimed that they were secret United States spy planes. They've also suggested that the aircraft were state-of-the-art drones that the US military was using to spy on Iran. However, the United States does not have the technology or capability for achieving Mach 10. It also seems unlikely that a spy aircraft would emit bright lights that would give its position away. Could the UFOs that Iran encountered be extraterrestrial? Is there any evidence to support that aliens have a special interest in Iranian nuclear sites? At this point in time, all we know is that on 3 separate occasions, skilled Iranian Air Force pilots encountered unidentified flying objects with advanced technological capabilities. There seems to be no definitive explanation for the UFOs encountered by Iranian military personnel. Whether the United States has advanced secret technology or Iran has encountered extraterrestrial UFOs, the 3 events still remain a mystery to this day. We have confirmed that a number of these unidentified objects are indeed solid. So said the leader of the Pentagon's newest investigation into UFOs, which you probably know as UAPs today. The long culture of ridicule is officially over. UFOs are real, they are here, and nobody has a clue who's building them. But while UFOs were part of American culture for nearly a century now, the world would be shocked at the disturbing similarities between events happening in the US and a world away behind the impenetrable Iron Curtain. The secrecy is over, and what has come from declassified sources both within the former Soviet government and the CIA itself is nothing short of terrifying. Soviet sightings of UFOs run as long as sightings in America, but most Soviet citizens had no clue what was going on in their own backyards. Thanks to a strict culture of secrecy and censorship, it wasn't until Glasnost started to open Soviet society up that the lid on the Soviet UFO secret finally came unscrewed. Some news outlets purposefully dramatized relatively ordinary events as they exercised newly found freedoms and pushed just to see how far they could take things. However, there were plenty of very real UFO-related events happening, and some were high-profile enough to catch the attention of CIA spies behind the Iron Curtain. On January 29, 1986, at 7:55 p.m., a quote, amazing event occurred on Hill 611 near the village of Dalnegorsk in Primorsky Krai. This small mining town is of no note, but that night it would become the most important place in the entire Soviet Union. That evening, multiple villagers observed a reddish sphere flying into the town from the southeast. The object flew while making no noise and appeared to be a nearly perfect sphere of rust red. It got close enough for people to observe that the outer skin of this strange craft was without blemish and had no obvious control surfaces nor means of propulsion. For a while, the object hovered up and down over the village, moving at a relatively slow pace. As it ascended, it would glow brighter before dimming as it descended. Suddenly, the object appeared to be in distress. All witnesses interviewed later by Soviet authorities recalled just how the object jerked or jumped suddenly, then fell like a rock straight down onto Hill 611. Witnesses heard a dull thump as it impacted and then began to burn intensely for an hour. Valery Voshilny, head of the Far Eastern Committee for Anomalous Phenomena, arrived at the site 2 days after the crash. He noticed that despite everything being covered in deep snow, the site of the crash was completely devoid of it, allowing him to observe splintered silica rocks, which could only have occurred from extreme temperatures. The rocks were also smoky looking, as if they'd been exposed to intense heat. However, Voshilny also found physical evidence of the craft. All over the site, embedded in the rocks themselves, he discovered silvery pieces of metal. Some were fragments, but a large amount had formed into droplets, almost as if they'd been sprayed over the area. This detail would become significant after the fall of the Iron Curtain, when Western UFOologists would compare notes with their Eastern counterparts. American witnesses had very often reported seeing flying orbs, which seemed to spray metal while showing signs of some kind of distress. At the edge of the crash site was a tree stump that had been severely burned and emitted a strange chemical smell. The physical remains were examined at the Omsk branch of the Academy of Sciences, who made a shocking discovery. Some of the fragments had formed into what appeared to be small nets, and when these were put under examination, it was discovered that they were made up of torn and very thin threads, 17 micrometers in width. Each thread consisted of even thinner fibers tied up in plates, and intertwined with the fibers were thin, solid gold wires. The technology to replicate this type of delicate nano-construction wouldn't appear on the Earth for decades, at least not in human hands anyway. The fragments, which had formed into iron balls, were also put under a battery of tests. Each ball consisted of iron with various levels of aluminum, manganese, nickel, chromium, tungsten, and cobalt. This seemed to rule out a natural creation and the object just being a very peculiar meteorite. Rather, it mostly confirmed that the object was built from heterogeneous alloys. When the balls were melted in a vacuum chamber, they reacted in various ways. On one base, they would melt and spread out as expected, but on another, they formed into smaller balls with convex glass-like structures. But melting the remains revealed yet another mystery. Gold, silver, and nickel would disappear from the balls and be replaced with molybdenum, despite not being present in the sanitized test chamber before testing commenced. The metallic remains would confuse Soviet scientists, as they only produced more questions than answers. About the only thing they were able to identify was ashes discovered on the site belonging to a biological being. Perhaps the ashes belonged to an unfortunate animal caught under the crash, or perhaps they belonged to the operator of the mysterious UFO. Sadly, the intense heat made any attempt at identification impossible. Unable to tease out details from the remains, the investigation turned to the object itself before it crashed. The trajectory as reported by eyewitnesses happens to coincide with the flight path taken by rockets launched by China's Xishang Cosmodrome. However, investigators weren't able to verify if any launches had taken place in January from the complex, and the Chinese were not forthcoming with any answers, likely looking to keep their space program as secret as possible. However, the investigation revealed something very startling. Soviet citizens had not been the first to spot this mysterious object. The Chinese had already observed it over their own territory. Just days prior to the crash, witnesses close to the Xishang Cosmodrome reported a similar red sphere on January 25th. According to witnesses, the object appeared to simply hover, almost as if observing the Cosmodrome directly. After half an hour, it disappeared. The Chinese sighting wasn't the only clue that this object had traveled great distances, though. There was physical evidence, too. Examination of the soil at the crash site revealed small pieces of light gray-colored soil, but only in the area where the object was presumed to have made direct contact before exploding and mostly disintegrating. Put under spectroscopic analysis, the light gray soil was matched with soil from another area in Russia thousands of miles away. The soil matched tufts from the area of Yaroslavl, northeast of Moscow, containing characteristic elements found there and not in the Dalnogorsk area. Whatever had crashed there, it was obvious somebody came looking for it, though. 8 days after the crash on Hill 611 at 8:30 p.m. on February 8, 1986, eyewitnesses once more reported strange objects in the sky. This time, 2 yellowish spheres flew into the town from the north. The spheres seemed to be looking for something and made their way directly to the crash site. Once there, they circled the crash site 4 times, then turned to the north and flew back the way they came. Was it a search and rescue effort by whatever had sent the original sphere there, or simply something wanting to make sure no identifiable remains had been left behind? To this day, nobody knows, but reports of flying spheres exactly mirror similar reports from all the way across the ocean in the United States. And the following year, whoever had visited the sleeping mining town returned in force. November 28, 1987, 11:24 p.m. Reports of flying spheres flood a local military base. Terrified villagers report seeing as many as 32 flying objects, which spread out over 12 different nearby villages. Alarmed Soviet military personnel quickly make their way to the nearest villages and observe the strange flying lights for themselves. Before the night was over, hundreds of civilians and military personnel would bear witness to one of the largest mass UFO sightings in history. The objects appeared specifically interested in Dalnogorsk, and 13 of them broke away and flew directly to the mining village. Once there, 3 of them hovered stationary over the village, while 5 seemed to illuminate the nearby mountain and crash site. They appeared to move with no discernible propulsion and made no noise, hovering at varying altitudes between 150 and 800 meters. As the lights flew over homes, people reported disturbances of their electrical equipment. Ministry of Internal Affairs officers would later testify that they observed multiple objects at 11:30 p.m. One object flew toward them from the direction of the Gorley settlement, leaving a, quote, fiery flame behind it. At the head of the flame was an opaque sphere, and within that sphere was another smaller red sphere. At a local quarry, eyewitnesses observed a large cylindrical object the size of a 5-story building flying directly toward them. The object was around 200 or 300 meters, with the front lit up like burning metal. Terrified that the object was going to crash into them, many of them fled for shelter. The quarry manager observed the object moving at an altitude of about 300 meters. Large and cigar-shaped, the description would also precisely fit that given by American and Western European witnesses of very similar objects. The object appeared to fly without the aid of wings and no discernible propulsion, making no noise as it flew over the quarry. Nearby, a kindergarten teacher observed a dark metallic-looking elongated object she estimated at 10 to 12 meters long. The object appeared to be in front of a bright, blinding sphere of light that hovered noiselessly at the height of a 9-story building. The object hovered over a school and shot a half-meter wide violet-bluish ray down at the ground in front of the school. The teacher remarked that the objects caught in the ray did not create shadows as would be expected if they were being illuminated from above. The object then departed the school and moved to a nearby mountain. According to her, the object appeared to be searching for something, emitting a reddish projector-like light onto the mountain. Finally, the object simply departed by flying over the mountain and out of sight. The crash and subsequent UFO invasion of Dalnegorsk would remain secret for years, but once it made its way into the West, the similarities between this event and multiple similar events in the US would convince researchers that Americans and Soviets were both observing the same mysterious phenomenon. Cigar-shaped objects and mysterious balls of light are a commonly reported type of UFO in the US for decades, and multiple eyewitnesses have reported what they thought were malfunctioning air or spacecraft of some kind which bobbed up and down, as reported by the Dalnegorsk witnesses, while emitting a shower of what appeared to be molten metal. Curiously, some of the craft described by the Dalnegorsk witnesses bear a strong resemblance to the infamous US Navy Tic Tac video, filmed by fighter pilots intercepting an unidentified aircraft over the Pacific Ocean. But this isn't the only parallels between Soviet and American UFO sightings, because while America had Roswell, the Soviets also had their own close encounter with alien beings, and their encounter had more and better witnesses than Roswell. It is not a joke nor a hoax nor a sign of mental instability nor an attempt to drum up local tourism by drawing the curious, so said the Soviet state press agency TASS, discussing a UFO close encounter in 1989. According to the official report, 2 boys and a girl from a local school were playing in a park on the evening of September 27th. At approximately 6:30, the children observed something pink shining in the sky, followed by a ball of deep red colors they estimated at 9 meters in diameter. A small crowd gathered as the ball seemed to land, and a hatch opened in the lower part of the ball. From within the ball, 3 aliens with 3 eyes each exited, standing nearly 3 meters tall. The aliens seemed to have a robot companion with them, which they activated with a touch. As the crowd watched in awe, the aliens seemed to communicate with each other, ignoring the onlookers, until a young boy screamed in terror. Suddenly, one of the aliens locked his 3 eyes on the child and caused him to become temporarily paralyzed. The 3 aliens then re-entered their vehicle, but quickly re-emerged, with one carrying what the crowd thought was a gun of some kind. The alien aimed the tube at a 16-year-old boy who suddenly vanished, only to reappear after the aliens re-entered their craft to depart. The story was met with both ridicule and a serious investigation, as is typical of UFO reports. To this day, accounts vary. A Soviet evening news correspondent dispatched to the town with a film crew failed to find any eyewitnesses to the aliens except for the children. However, they did speak with the local police chief, who confirmed one important detail of the account. He too had seen a large, silently flying craft shortly before the alleged landing took place. Soil analysis discovered high concentrations of radioactive isotopes in the landing area, but this proved inconclusive, as after the Chernobyl disaster it was not uncommon to discover small pockets of highly concentrated radioactive isotopes. However, what's curious is that if it was a hoax, the children just happened to pick a landing spot with said high concentrations of isotopes, which would require analysis in a lab to even identify. Even more curious, when the children were separated into different rooms by investigators, they all drew nearly the exact same craft from memory. The craft was also said to leave behind a mysterious X-shaped sign in the sky as it took off, exactly mirroring UFO encounters reported in the United States by the defunct American magazine Saga in 1976. Given the strict censorship of the Soviet Union in the 70s, it is nigh an impossibility the children or police chief would have had access to said magazine. But why were there no other eyewitnesses to the alien beings themselves? One only need to look at the culture of ridicule surrounding UFOs to understand why a bunch of adults in the repressive communist Soviet Union would not want to speak up about such an extraordinarily weird event. As highlighted in the United States' own recent UAP investigation, a culture of ridicule has, quote, hampered our efforts to collect good data, as pilots are self-censoring for the fear of ridicule and it affecting their future careers. The U.S. Air Force and Navy took that recommendation so seriously that they immediately instituted new guidelines for reporting UFOs, ending the infamous century-long culture of ridicule that silenced witnesses even amongst America's most elite military units. Soviet pilots, however, were long reporting UFOs and on occasion even being killed by them. While on a routine flight over the city of Borisov, 2 Soviet fighters spotted a large flying disc near the city. The disc seemed to have 5 beams of light emanating from it. 2 were directed upwards into the sky, and 3 were pointed down at the ground. Ground control instructed the patrol to fly in for a closer look, an act that would doom one of the pilots. On approach, the disc suddenly flew up to match the speed and level with the lead Soviet fighter. Suddenly, it aimed one of its beams directly at the plane, filling the cockpit with blinding light. The co-pilot was at the controls, and the flight logs recorded him reporting a bright ray of light entering the cockpit and projecting a spot about 20 centimeters in diameter. This ray of light swept across the cockpit and directly through the pilot's body. With both pilot and co-pilot reporting extreme heat, the plane broke off and returned to base immediately. Shortly afterwards, the co-pilot's health immediately deteriorated with frequent fainting spells that forced him into retirement. The aircraft commander, however, died within a few months of the incident, with the cause of death listed as cancer. This wouldn't be the only report of a UFO shooting beams of light, though. A declassified CIA report notes an encounter with hundreds of eyewitnesses, including a Major V. Loganov outside the city of Omsk. In his own official report, the Major states that he and other eyewitnesses spotted a strange object in the sky which radar could not pick up. The object passed overhead at an altitude of several kilometers, revealing a shining sphere 1.5 times as large as the current full moon. The object was casting 4 very bright beams of light, sometimes parallel to the ground and sometimes at an angle. The UFO hovered over a civilian airport for 5 minutes and even descended a bit. Suddenly, the beams of light disappeared and a whirling plume trail appeared around the shining sphere. With an extraordinary burst of speed, the object took off to the east. Pilots from a nearby second airport reported seeing the object but being unable to pick it up on their radars. Immediately relaying the sighting up the chain of command, within 5 minutes, other military personnel at Alte-Cray reported having the same object under visual observation. Given the time and distance, the object appeared to have traveled 600 kilometers at a speed of about 7,000 kilometers an hour. UFO sightings were so frequent in the Soviet Union that the declassified CIA report also notes a meeting of 100 Soviet scientists from various disciplines, all meeting together to discuss the dramatic uptick in UFO sightings in the 1970s and the 1980s. It's now known that some UFO reports inside the Soviet Union were highly secretive U.S. air and spacecraft. Other sightings were misattributed to everything from secret rocket launches to failed rockets or simply spent rocket stages. However, just like multiple American UFO investigations would reveal, that still left a significant number, about 5% of sightings that simply could not be explained. And most disturbing of all were reports from Soviet nuclear facilities of unidentified craft that perfectly mirror similar reports from the United States in the same time period. In one high-profile encounter, a UFO nearly started World War III. Colonel Boris Solikov spoke with Western UFO investigators after the fall of the Soviet Union, reporting that on the night of October 4, 1982, there was a breach of airspace over a nuclear weapons site in Usovoyen, Ukraine. Solikov, who was working at the Kremlin at the time, described receiving alarmed reports from the facility, whose operators had informed him their launch panels all had suddenly activated on their own, something which should have been impossible. For 4 hours, the entire facility watched a hovering UFO as it loitered directly overhead. While it hovered, the control panels, which could launch the nuclear weapons stored there, suddenly came to life, something which could have only happened with the input of the proper launch codes. The incident sparked a 10-year investigation by the Soviets into the UFO phenomenon, which they kept under wraps until the end of the Cold War. This event closely mirrors a similar incident at a U.S. nuclear facility in Minot Air Force Base, when security personnel observed a UFO which hovered over the silos holding America's nuclear-tipped Minuteman missiles. According to witnesses, the missiles briefly became active and went into launch state, despite having received no such authorization or command from their control centers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, UFO reports around Soviet nuclear facilities remain very difficult to verify, but the Soviet Union had a plethora of otherworldly sightings which only grew in number as the Cold War dragged on. At 4:05 a.m. on September 20, 1977, a group of dock workers in Petrozavodsk witnessed a blinding light on the horizon from the direction of Lake Onega. The light approached the slumbering city before shifting into the shape of a glimmering jellyfish, whom, according to eyewitnesses, began to hover over the city and shoot thin beams of light down into the city. The dock workers were terrified, concerned that their nation was under attack. This being the height of the Cold War, paranoia over a nuclear conflict between the Soviet Union and the US was running high. After 12 minutes of shooting beams of light down into the city, the UFO transformed once more into a bright semicircle and shot back off in the direction it came. Suddenly, it veered upwards and punched through the clouds, leaving a burning red hole where it passed that quickly dissipated. Later that morning, more witnesses would come forward, and the list would grow from the initial dock workers to police officers, sailors, and an ambulance crew, and a reporter for the state news agency. Under pressure to prevent an all-out alarm, the reporter would post a story 3 days later calling the phenomenon strange and natural. The object left no physical evidence behind save for a photograph allegedly taken of the object by one of the witnesses. However, given the veil of secrecy in the Soviet Union at the time, the photograph has been impossible to verify. However, neighboring local governments became so alarmed by the incident that they demanded an answer from the Kremlin leadership. When they were unable to provide a satisfactory response, the event was taken to the Academy of Sciences, where the Soviet Union's most prolific scientific minds worked. They couldn't come up with an explanation for the sighting, but after doing some research concluded that the UFO phenomenon was very real and required more dedicated investigation. The Academy's secret investigation started a year later and ran all the way until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unofficially known as the Network, this government-backed investigation ran for 13 years and had one goal: scientifically understand the UFO phenomenon. The network enjoyed the support of 20 different organizations staffed by specialists in physics, chemistry, optics, and spectroscopy. The initial investigation was kept top secret for 2 reasons. Either it would verify the existence of extraterrestrial life, or the findings could have some form of defense value. The network also had to coordinate its investigation with the Defense Ministry, a task which created some conflict. Where scientists working for the network found a mystery needing scientific investigation, the Defense Ministry simply saw a threat or potential enemy. Thus, the 2 sides had vastly differing approaches to their UFO investigations. Even so, the 2 sides worked together to gather UFO data. The network gathered reports from scientific institutes and Soviet citizens, while the Defense Ministry gathered them from within the Soviet military, perhaps spurred on by repeated violations of their air and space by very advanced American aircraft, first the U-2 and then the Blackbird spy aircraft. Soviet soldiers were under strict orders to report all mysterious phenomenon, especially if it interfered with their equipment. This was stark in contrast to the US, where a culture of ridicule had sprung up in both the military and civilian sectors, despite multiple ongoing secret investigations by the Department of Defense. The network would go on to investigate 3,000 UFO reports, debunking all but 300 of them, which they had no explanation for. The results would mirror both the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book effort and the latest investigation into UAPs by the Department of Defense, but this debunking work was critical for the understanding of what was a real UFO and what wasn't, even when the Soviet Union's secrecy made such work difficult. The Petrozavodsk event, for instance, would be solved by an American engineer working for NASA who put together the pieces missed by the Soviets. Using NASA's satellite tracking center, he discovered that the Soviets had launched an object from their top-secret cosmodrome in nearby Plesetsk at 3:58 a.m. just minutes before the sighting. However, that doesn't explain the motion witnessed and attested to by many observers. Rockets can only go up, even if they do so at a very diagonal angle. They certainly can't hover, and they can't lose or gain altitude at will. Could the UFO then been a response to the top-secret launch minutes before, or was it a case of bad eyewitnesses being very mistaken about what they saw? We may never know the truth, but what we can be sure of is that something was recreating the same exact UFO phenomenon over the Soviet Union that was taking place over American skies. Disclaimer: all of the stories featured in this episode of the Infographics Show come from actual military service members or other government officials, many of them vetted by independent researchers and local or national media outlets. It was late on a chilly February morning, 2007. At approximately 0230 hours, a security patrol stationed inside the nuclear weapons storage area of Nellis Air Force Base, otherwise known as Area 2, called into Central Security Control a sighting of what appeared to be vehicle headlights far outside the outer perimeter fence, a mile or 2 in the distance. This wasn't uncommon, as Area 2 was detached from Nellis Air Force Base, and everything from hikers to off-road enthusiasts would inadvertently stumble upon the little-known facility in the desert. Following standard procedure, the 2 outer security patrols, Oscars 1 and 2, were dispatched to assume overwatch positions on the reported headlights. Their job, as it often was in these dark desert nights, was to simply observe, and if the civilian vehicle approached too close to the facility perimeter, intercept it and have them turn around. As the two outer security patrols arrived atop the tall bluffs overlooking the reported sighting area, they spotted and confirmed what appeared to be two vehicle headlights approaching down the side of a nearby mountain. Inside of the nuclear weapons storage area, two additional patrols had moved close to the section of the fence the vehicle headlights were approaching, along with the site security supervisor, Security 1. A grand total of 11 Air Force security personnel were watching when suddenly the lights disappeared. Fearing that the oncoming off-road vehicle had turned off its headlights so as not to be tracked, Oscar 1 left its position on the bluffs and moved to an intercept position along the incoming vehicle's estimated avenue of approach. The site's security controller requested the assistance of a main base K9 unit, which had happened to be in the area, and the two patrols linked up, leaving their vehicles behind, moved out to the desert to set up an LPOP, or Listening Post Observation Post. The desert, though, was quiet. Despite the incoming vehicle having been within 2 miles of the fence line, there was no sound of a revving engine across the still, dark desert. Scans with both thermal imagers and night vision goggles revealed nothing. And then suddenly, the radio came to life. Patrols on the interior of the nuclear weapons depot began calling in lights on either side of the dismounted Oscar 1 and K9 patrol. From their vantage point atop the tall igloo-style weapon bunkers, they could see a series of lights appear in the 12 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 3 o'clock of the dismounted patrolmen. Incredibly though, the 3 men and 1 dog on the ground could see nor hear anything. Then the site security supervisor came on the radio. "Oscar 1, be advised, the lights are moving on you." The 3 mysterious lights, seen only by interior patrols, suddenly rushed the dismounted patrolman. The senior patrol leader ordered his partner and the K9 patrolman to lock and load. With lights approaching their position on the desert floor at high speed, he was taking no chances. As far as he was concerned, the mysterious and now aggressive behavior of the lights indicated hostile intent. What happened next depends on which side of the fence line you happen to have been on. For the 3 patrolmen and 1 dog on the outside of the fence line, nothing happened. The 3 men held their breath, M4s at the ready, and nervously scanned the desert with thermals and night vision but spotted nothing. They even checked with the dog, who was trained to indicate if it sensed danger, and yet nothing. After a few minutes, the patrol leader called back in over the radio to ask for an update on the lights, but received nothing but static. Trying a second and then third radio, the exterior patrols got no reply and slowly walked back to their vehicles to attempt to make contact with the interior patrols again. On the inside of the fence, though, at least 24 security forces patrolmen, including the Master Sergeant Security Supervisor, had seen the lights converge on the location of the dismounted patrol and then simply disappear. Even more incredibly though, when the exterior patrolmen finally made contact with the interior patrols, they were told they'd been out of contact for 20 minutes. Yet each man involved in the incident on the outside of the fence line swore that only 3 or 4 minutes had passed for them. Where had the other 15 minutes of time, all spent without radio contact, gone? Things would only get weirder, though, before they got any better. This incident would prove to be only the opening act to some of the strangest events ever reported by U.S. military personnel. And we can tell you about it in first person because at the infographic show, we got a chance to sit down with one of the security forces patrolmen involved in these incidents. After the exterior light show incident, things started to get weird. I mean, there had always been weird things out in Area 2. We had everything from ghost stories to weird animal sightings. I'd probably think it was all BS or just tricks the dark plays on you, except a lot of this stuff was seen by numerous people at the same time, or with the help of pretty advanced night vision and thermal imaging devices. What started happening after the lights incident, though, took the cherry in weird and outright dangerous. Within a week of the incident, one of the daytime exterior patrols ran across the corpse of a donkey, which wasn't that weird since there was no civilization around us and animals sometimes wandered out there. What was weird, though, was that this donkey had no head. It was cleanly cut off, and there was some crusted blood around the neck, but there was no blood anywhere around the body on the ground. We ended up shrugging it off, figuring that somebody had butchered the animal, just dumped it in the desert, completely unaware of how close they got to our facility in doing so. But then, just a few days later, another donkey corpse was found, and this one was missing its head and all 4 of its legs. Again, no vehicle tracks, no blood on the ground, just a decapitated legless donkey. The very next day after that, a third donkey was discovered by an exterior patrol, this time at night. This donkey was also missing its head and legs, but it had its stomach cut open with 1 clean incision, and the entire contents of the body cavity were gone. Once more, there was no blood on the desert floor and no vehicle tracks. We forgot about the donkeys after a while, and even though people kept reporting strange lights, nothing too dramatic happened until about 6 months later. What happened next took the cake. It was almost a full-blown national nuclear security incident. We used to practice assaulting our own storage facilities just in case bad guys got in and tried to steal a nuke, or just barricaded themselves so they could set off a nuke in place and irradiate large swaths of Nevada. One of those nights we underwent our usual exercise scenario, involving a response by multiple patrols and an assault into our designated training structure. All in all, somewhere around 17 to 18 people were involved. Most of the patrols were at the assault training structure, but we kept the patrol armed with an M249 machine gun on overwatch just to keep an eye on the desert behind us. Now, Area 2, the nuclear weapons storage depot, was huge, several square miles, so there was lots of empty desert inside the fence perimeter. As we were lining up to assault the training structure, we suddenly got a call over the radio from our overwatch patrol located on a hill about a quarter-mile from us. The patrol said, "Hey, you got two figures lying prone in the desert behind you." We assumed this was part of the training exercise, so our on-scene commander redeployed a small element to secure our rear as the rest of the response force prepared to assault. However, our flight leader, or security supervisor, immediately came running up to us and told us to lock and load. He then called over the radio and told Central Security Control to terminate the exercise. Then he turned to look at us and said, "I didn't put anyone out in the desert. Whoever's out there is not us." Now, our security supervisor was in charge of running the exercises, and he would task random people with playing the bad guys. So when he told us that he hadn't put anyone out there, our blood ran cold. This was about as high a security area as you can get in the US military, home to dozens of nuclear weapons. Anyone who had somehow penetrated our security was not here to have a friendly chat. We immediately returned our magazines to our weapons and charged them, switching safeties off. Our Overwatch patrol had good eyes on the figures. One of the guys on that patrol was using a sensitive thermal camera, and the other was using night vision. That's the standard procedure for us since it gives you two vision modes to ID a target. According to them, the figures seemed to be laying on their bellies, watching us from about 100 meters behind, hiding behind a small berm. The desert out there was pitch black, so we got into a long line and formed a sweeping element. Two heavy gunners on Humvees watched our backs and got ready to light up anything that turned hostile as we started our sweep in the desert. As we approached, our Overwatch patrol warned us that the figures were crawling into new positions. They were actually reacting to our movements and trying to remain hidden. According to the two guys who could see them over night vision and the thermal unit, the figures appeared frantic, as if panicking at having been discovered observing us. Yet they never stood up and stayed low on the ground on their bellies. For us, on the sweeping element, we couldn't see a thing, despite also using our own night vision goggles. However, the desert was thick with brush, so staying unseen would have been pretty easy for anyone laying low. We kept on moving forward, weapons at the ready, as our Overwatch patrol stayed in constant contact with us, letting us know what the figures were doing. Then, as we got within 25 meters, they just vanished. According to the Overwatch patrol, the two figures were there one moment and then completely disappeared the next. No flash of light, no sound, nothing, just disappeared. We rushed forward to the last known location and swept the area, finding nothing. Although one of our guys had brought his handheld thermal imager and was actually able to pick up traces of warmth on the desert floor. Somebody or something had in fact been laying on that floor, long enough to heat it up, watching us as we practiced our assault techniques. That incident might have been bone-chilling to hear about, definitely to have lived through, but it was far from the only incident involving possible UFOs or even aliens and nuclear weapons. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and even the Soviet Union had several extremely high-profile incidents involving nuclear weapons and UFOs, and these incidents have been reported by individuals with extremely high levels of credibility. In 1977, unidentified flying objects not only proved that they could intrude on U.S. airspace unimpeded, but that they might even have full control over our nuclear weapons. As told by United States Air Force Technical Sergeant Thomas E. Johnson, who was a flight security supervisor at the time, one night a security alert team was dispatched in response to strange lights low in the sky. At the time, Johnson was stationed at a North Dakota missile field, home to dozens of Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles housed in underground silos, ready to fire on the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. As the team neared the reported area, they spotted lights in the sky ahead of them, varying in color. The lights would zoom from one location to another at impossible speeds, or other times would simply blink out in one location and blink in at another location. The security team leader said that he couldn't tell if they were multiple objects or just one incredibly fast object. Prior to the incident, the security personnel had been briefed by Air Force Office of Special Investigation agents that unknown helicopters had been reported at other Strategic Air Command bases. The Office of Special Investigation, or OSI, is like the Air Force's FBI, and the special briefings indicated that something very peculiar was going on at other U.S. Air Force bases. Yet that night, the object, or objects, didn't move like helicopters and made no sound. What they did do, though, was far more terrifying. Directly under the lights, the missile launch officers responsible for launching the Minutemen in case of war reported that they lost control over some of the 10 missiles they were in charge of. One of the launch officers later said that they couldn't communicate with the missiles, and if they had needed the launch, they would have been unable to. Incredibly, though, this type of incident would be repeated numerous times throughout the Cold War, and sometimes the actual targeting codes programmed into each missile would be altered or completely erased. Each of these occurrences always happened in conjunction with sightings of UFOs. Are UFOs monitoring our nuclear weapon sites? Is it a coincidence that every major nuclear weapon or production facility in the United States has a long history of UFO sightings? For a growing number of people, the UFO interest in our nuclear weapons is very real, and the case was only strengthened when, after the fall of the Soviet Union, former Soviet military and government officials revealed that their nuclear sites had also been host to UFO incidents.
On June 24, 1947, pilot Kenneth Arnold was flying in the vicinity of Mount Rainier in Washington when he suddenly spotted something shiny in the sky with him. Turning his aircraft to get a better look, Arnold claims to have seen a string of 8 bright, saucer-shaped objects being led by a larger crescent-shaped object. After about 2 minutes, all of the objects accelerated and disappeared, leaving Arnold's small plane behind. Today we'll take a look at one of the world's greatest mysteries in this special episode of the Infographic Show, UFOs. Kenneth Arnold's Mount Rainier sighting kicked off the modern UFO craze and established the term flying saucer in all our minds. Since then, humanity has been obsessed with the question, are we alone or are we being visited by beings from another world? We'll explore these questions today with the top 4 most mysterious UFO events ever reported. Number 4 is an American classic, the UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico. Just a few weeks after the Kenneth Arnold sighting, the Air Force recovered debris from an allegedly crashed flying saucer in Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell Army Airfield Public Information Officer Walter Hott initially released a press release stating that military personnel had recovered a flying disc. However, this was quickly retracted by the Air Force, which then claimed that the object was just a weather balloon. 50 years later, in 1997, the US government declassified documents showing that it had indeed been operating a secret high-altitude program in the New Mexico skies, sending up balloons made of high-tech, lightweight, and flame-retardant materials that carried sensitive microphones into the Earth's troposphere, where they could eavesdrop on Soviet nuclear tests. With no satellites in orbit, and given the secrecy of the Soviet nuclear program, it would have been important to keep any such attempts to eavesdrop on the Soviets out of public knowledge, and a captured flying saucer made for a great cover until nationwide UFO hysteria threatened to create a panic. While many still refuse to accept the official explanation, the evidence is staggering. The 297-page declassified report has been substantiated by many members of the then secret program, but perhaps more telling is the mundane nature of the objects recovered in the crash, as described by those on the scene. Objects such as rubber, tinfoil, paper, and tape. With any possible visiting aliens being greatly technologically superior to us, we'd like to think they'd make their spaceships out of things more advanced than tinfoil and tape. At number 3 is the first possible conflict between man and alien, the Battle of Los Angeles. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans expected Japanese raids against the West Coast to be imminent. The US Army dispatched batteries of anti-aircraft guns to major coastal cities in response, including Los Angeles. On the evening of February 23, 1942, military spotters reported blinking lights in the sky above LA, sending the anti-aircraft crews into high alert. A few hours later, however, the lights were gone. The next night, a radar contact was reported 180 miles west of Los Angeles over the Pacific Ocean. What happened next is a bit murky. Some military personnel and civilians claim to have heard and even seen up to a dozen aircraft in the sky, while others claim that a large glowing shape hovered above the city, partially obscured by the cloud cover. Immediately, the alarm was raised and a citywide blackout was ordered as dozens of anti-aircraft batteries and .50 caliber machine guns began to fire into the pitch black sky. Powerful spotlights scanned the sky looking for targets, and an hour later, over 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft shells had been fired into the night sky. The people in the city believed they were under all-out enemy attack, but dawn broke shortly after, only to reveal a bunch of confused air defense crews and no enemies in sight. With no official explanation, Japan was asked about the incident at the end of the war. They confirmed that they had never launched aircraft over Los Angeles. Yet shortly after the end of the war, the United States War Department revealed that 1 to 5 radar contacts had definitely been recorded that night and no US planes were in the area. Did the United States fire the first shot in a war against an alien species? Or were wartime jittery nerves and primitive radar technology to blame? Sadly, we may never know. They say everything is bigger in Texas, including their UFO encounters. And number 2 is a famous and unsettling account of motorist harassment by something possibly otherworldly. On the night of November 2nd, 1957, immigrant farmers Pedro Saucedo and Joe Salas were driving down a lonely Texas road near the small town of Levelland when they suddenly spotted a flash of blue light ahead of them. Their truck immediately died as it lost all electric power, and as it rolled to a stop, they witnessed a strange object rising up off the road ahead of them and move in their direction. Pedro jumped out of the truck and hid in a nearby bush, while Joe, paralyzed with fear, remained in the truck. An object later described as rocket-shaped flew directly over the vehicle, rocking it violently and giving off intense heat and powerful wind gusts. Terrified, the two men immediately found a payphone and called the local police department. Officer A.J. Fowler answered their call and, initially believing the call to be a joke, immediately dismissed it. However, an hour later, his phone rang again. Another motorist driving down the same road reported coming across a brilliantly lit egg-shaped object that also shut down the power to his car before flying over it and disappearing. Still skeptical, Officer Fowler made a note of the report but didn't pay it much mind until another caller came in at 10:55 p.m. This time, the call was made by a married couple driving northeast of Levelland. This couple also reported a bright flash moving across the sky, which killed their car's headlights and radio for a few seconds as it passed overhead. Just 5 minutes after taking the couple's statement, his phone rang once more with yet another motorist claiming that a strange object sitting on the road had caused his vehicle to lose power as well, only turning back on when the object rose up from the road and flew away. In total, 15 calls came in to Officer Fowler, who dispatched 3 police officers to look for the object. Of the 3, Sheriff Ware Clem also encountered the object at around 1:30 a.m. with the same results. His car experienced electrical malfunctions and died, only to restart once the object disappeared. An official investigation by the US Air Force claimed that the objects spotted by Sheriff Clem and 15 other motorists were nothing more than ball lightning, and that the electrical failures were due to faulty wiring. Yet, those present on that November night have never bought the official explanation, and with so many eyewitnesses having such close encounters, it's a little hard to believe they would all confuse lightning for an alien spacecraft. At number 1 is something much more recent and substantiated with modern military technology. In 2004, Commander David Fravor and another pilot were flying during a training mission with their FA-18F Super Hornets about 100 miles off the coast of San Diego. Midway through their training mission, the Navy cruiser USS Princeton contacted them and requested they investigate several mysterious objects the ship was tracking on a radar. The pilots were briefed that the Princeton had established radar tracks on a number of whitish, 40-foot-long tic-tac-shaped objects that would suddenly appear at an altitude of 80,000 feet, descend towards the ocean, and hover at 20,000 feet before dropping out of radar range or blasting back up into the night sky. Working together, the Super Hornets and the Princeton tracked one object via radar, and Commander Fravor managed to get close enough to make visual contact with the object. For a few seconds, Commander Fravor said that he could clearly see a whitish, pulsating object that seemed to rotate as it flew. However, as if sensing the Super Hornets had drawn near, the object immediately accelerated and blasted out of sight. Perhaps the best part about this encounter is the fact that the close contact by Commander Fravor was all recorded via his gun camera. In the video, you can clearly see the object being pursued by fighter jets, and you can hear Commander Fravor and his wingman excitedly describe the object rotating, and at one point exclaim in surprise that there's a whole fleet of them. The incident was classified for many years until the gun camera footage showed up online in 2017. Despite numerous requests for comment, the Department of Defense has maintained its silence on the matter.
Note: the following is based on testimony provided over a series of interviews and written correspondence, edited and cut together in an attempt to create a cohesive timeline of the events as described. It was 1968, if I remember correctly, and somewhere around the Cambodian border. We were getting the lay of the land on an LRRP, tracking supply routes into South Vietnam along Cambodia and mapping them out for future raids, and for the B-52 bombing campaign the following year that smashed the whole place to hell. The object sort of appeared overhead all of a sudden, a bright red-orange glow, and it looked like it was sort of melting. I don't know why, only some of us looked up in time, and we only got a brief glimpse through the tree cover. It was over our heads and then gone in a flash. I couldn't tell you how high it was or how fast it was moving, but maybe 4-5 seconds later there was a loud crash, and then a dull thump that you could feel through the ground. That let us know that it had fallen somewhere nearby. We figured it was a US plane, though for the life of me I couldn't tell you what the original shape of it was when it plummeted overhead. It was just too fast. All I remembered was the orange glow and thinking of molten metal. I even ducked, expecting some of it to fall on me. We were close enough to the northern border that we knew better than to use our long-range radios openly. The Soviets had sent their own Special Forces advisors armed with pretty good electronic snooping gear, and if they were nearby, they could pinpoint your location pretty accurately. We were now on a rescue mission, as far as everyone was concerned, and figured we'd hold off on the radios until we got to the crash site and asked for extraction. Turns out the damn thing was further than we thought, good 3 to 4 miles through awful terrain. When we got there, though, it was immediately obvious this was not a US plane, or at least nothing like any of us ever knew about. Our captain, obviously we're going to withhold names, had been in the black world for a while and knew there was some stuff flying over Vietnam made in the US that the public still didn't know about, but nothing like this. It reminded me of a giant metal egg that had just cracked wide open when it crashed. The entire scene was incredibly warm, and at first I thought this was just some crashed space capsule, maybe Soviet, since we were in their neck of the woods, but it was a dull gray and it looked like it had been made from a single piece of metal. There were no seams or bolts or screws. I've seen the way 3D printers work nowadays, and it looked like they'd been made that same way. I never got a good look in the inside, so I couldn't tell you much about it. The brush around it was on fire, and it was hard to see inside through the broken side of the craft. I couldn't tell you if there were any occupants. I didn't see any myself. We called in the crash and reported ourselves on scene, but were surprised to learn that there were already some birds en route. We got told to secure the site, so we did just that while hoping the whole damn jungle wouldn't go up in flames. The first aircraft overhead was a pair of F-4s, which quickly settled into an orbit. That's what kinda tipped us off that this was something real serious. I know this sounds silly now, but at the time we honestly didn't know what this damn thing was. The fire around it made it so hard to actually see the thing. Most of us still just thought it was either NASA or something Soviet. Anyway, I think the Air Force guys were overhead to ward off any curious Vietnamese MiGs. The first choppers to arrive were Hueys full of infantry, but the infantry wasn't let anywhere near the craft. They were deployed in a wide swath around it. I don't know what they told those boys, but it took a good 2 days to get that damn thing out of the jungle. And obviously, there was a need to secure the site given how close it was to the border. We got choppered back pretty immediately though. Other SOF guys came in and they worked a little closer to the actual craft along with some Air Force and Navy eggheads. I found out later they were all already read into the program. That's what everyone called it, the program. And there were several rapid reaction units stationed throughout in theater. See, we learned from the Korean War that these things are attracted to conflict, and I guess that it makes sense. It's probably one of the most interesting things we do. A lot of people think this whole mess started in World War II, and maybe it did, but the program got put together during the Korean War, and that's when it was official. Anyway, I think the intel guys that read us in kinda jumped the gun a little. See, most of us were still of the opinion that this was just some space probe or something. They could have told us that and just let us go, and we'd lived the rest of our lives without a second thought. But I guess they thought we'd seen more than we did, so we got read in, kind of by force. As in, we had no choice. It was that or a dishonorable discharge, and I saw it happen once or twice. They fabricated an entire Article 15 or worse if they thought you'd be trouble. Everything to kill your credibility. Their favorite was drug charges. We all knew drugs were everywhere out there, so who was gonna listen to some washout kicked out for heroin? Back then, the world was a lot smaller than it is today. The last thing you wanted was for your community and your family to believe you got kicked out or washed out with a bad conduct discharge. So they read us in, only a little. People think you just get all the info at once. That's not how secret programs stay secret. We were only told what we needed to know. I didn't even realize those damn things were from space until I actually saw a body. And then it was sort of like, okay, yeah, you figured that out, here's a bit more info. For all I know, I never did learn the whole truth. But I do know a lot of it, and I'm kind of tired of sitting on it all these years. Plus, what are they going to do now to an old man? That's the thing. If they did anything to me or that Grush guy, well, it just sort of validate his story, right? Better leave us alone and let the world just think we're crazy. Speaking of Grush, I like him. He's confident, he's strict on following procedure. That's what makes him so frustrating. Everyone wants him to come out and say everything, but he's doing it right, only saying what he can outside of a classified briefing. I think he's a patriot. If he just wanted fame, he'd come out and say everything. Again, if they put him in jail for it, well, that's kind of admitting that he really did share some classified info, isn't it? Is he telling the truth, though? I don't know. A lot of what I've heard him say sounds right, but I've been out of it for 20 years now, and things change. And who knows what the whole truth is anyway. So, do I think he's lying or telling the truth? I think he's telling more truth than not, especially that part about aerospace contractors being involved. I know that's true, but I also don't ever underestimate how far these groups will go to create disinformation. And it's not just about deceiving the American public. Let me tell you, I spent about 30 years with the program, and the group is full of true blue-blooded patriots. He sort of had to be handling the most dangerous technology in the world. Imagine if we had another Manhattan Project and somebody ran off with a piece of that tech to the Soviets. Nobody liked lying to the public. But the thing people forget is we're not the only ones aware or at least suspecting that something is going on. The Soviets, well, the Russians now, the Chinese, hell, the Israelis too. Everyone's looking for any scrap of information they can get. Disinformation is real, but it's not directed at the American public. Well, mostly not. The fact is, I can tell you right now, the government does not want you thinking about UFOs. It makes recovery hard. It makes keeping it all a secret even harder. I don't think anyone was ever scared of mass panic or anything like that. Maybe now they are, I don't know. But not back then. It's all about keeping material out of the hands of the adversaries. Anyway, so after I got read in, you'd think there was some sort of special club you joined or something. Not really. Not for at least a year after that first crash, at least. We got put back on regular duty, only our unit got broken up. And that's bad. You don't do that to a team. But it happened. Also, I know for a fact we got put into the worst messes they could cook up. I know 5 of the original 12 died in combat, 3 more badly wounded. I think they were trying to kill us off. But about a year after that first crash, that's when I got brought in officially. As in, now my primary job was doing this stuff. Well, when it happened, it didn't happen often, but these things did fall out of the sky, or people would see something land or witness beings happening more often than people know, and we'd swoop in as fast as we could in case there was anything to snatch up. I think we pulled 3 total craft out of theater, and not just Vietnam. Damn near started a war with China in one recovery, but thank God their early warning systems were primitive back then, and it was close to the border. I don't think we could do that today. Europe was another hot spot, but most people don't know that. I'm not sure if anything ever crashed into the ocean. If it did, we definitely couldn't pull it out, I don't think. But Europe was always sort of ready for war at any moment. You had bombers with live nukes on constant patrol, electronic intelligence aircraft, military exercises all the time. All this on both sides of the border. A lot of activity. So they're probably curious. I think they did a better job keeping things quiet in Europe than in the US. But I think our media was a bit freer at the time, so you'd get UFO reports in major newspapers within a day of an event. Also, the Europeans kinda turned their nose up at the whole UFO thing. A lot more Americans were believers than Europeans, which made it easier to keep it a secret. The crafts themselves were extraordinary. That's the only way to describe them. I wasn't there for every single recovery, obviously, but they kept collections of them in different places and I got to see 2 of the collections. Everyone always looks at Wright-Patterson and the Foreign Technologies Division. How stupid do you think we are? That'd be the dumbest place to take this stuff because it'd be the first place Soviet spies would come looking. They wanted to know what we knew about them already. I can tell you what though, we faked some stuff going into Wright-Patterson, enough to stir up rumors because that's where we wanted the Soviets looking. It was fun, it was like a big game, and you had to play right into it. So a few enlisted guys spotted something strange and then they just let the rumor mill do its work. The real stuff didn't go to Wright-Patterson. There were a few government sites, sorry I don't want to tell you where because a lot of important work is still being done there, but there were these co-op sites run by the government and the big defense contractors, people like Raytheon, Boeing, everyone knows their names, but also people like Texas Instruments. It was a whole umbrella. But the little guys only got a tiny piece of the puzzle. Some guys from TI would get a piece of something and then be asked to figure out how it works, never being told where it came from. And on its own, I'm sure these eggheads had their suspicions, but it's hard to tell if something's actually alien. Alright, so that Grush guy is right about defense contractors being involved. You can't get their records, they're private companies. But you better believe that they don't pull the strings. Boeing's CEO isn't going to tell the US military he'll take the saucer out that they gave him for a joyride. But there are legal considerations, if this stuff becomes public and they reverse engineer it. Who owns the tech? Who gets to profit? Boeing or the US taxpayers who donated the stuff to keep it out of sight? I think a lot of people are thinking about that right now. The spacecraft themselves, and I'm only guessing they're spacecraft by the way, at least I know that they can go to space because we track them coming in and out all the time, but I don't think a lot of people are convinced that that's where they're really coming from. Instead, I think that's where they want us to think they're coming from. Anyway, so there are different shapes. The UFO people on the internet have done a pretty good job compiling the data on their own. I saw a chart someone made one time of the most commonly reported objects, and it's pretty accurate. So you got your flying eggs, your Tic Tacs, I guess you now call them, we just call them pills, your old-fashioned saucers, bells, triangles, whole mess of shapes. But the ones that crash are almost always the eggs and the bells, and they're smaller too. I think they're the drones that are remotely operated. And when they crash, you have to get really lucky because they have a habit of just disintegrating. Maybe it's a self-destruct mechanism, I don't know. The saucers, they were the crown jewels. I heard of several crashes, but I was only ever on a recovery of 2 saucers. I don't know what they're made of, but these things are tough. Once we recovered one in South America. I won't say where, because last I heard stuff was still ongoing there, and it wouldn't be very popular with the citizens if they found out their government was secretly collaborating with the US. Anyway, the saucer we recovered had hit the side of a rocky outcropping on its way down. It smashed the rock to pieces, then took out a 1/4 mile of trees. If it had happened on the outskirts of civilization, the whole UFO mystery would have been public knowledge by now. That's how much destruction that thing caused. But the craft itself was relatively unharmed. Later, once I was more senior and I moved into the administrative side of things, I learned the craft was either formed out of a single piece of material or put together at the atomic level. Incredibly strong stuff, however they do it. And like I said, not a single seam is visible. Even the entrance is invisible until it actually opens. That's how tight the tolerances are. By the way, that one took us a while to open. It took us a long time to figure out how to actually open these things without resorting to destructive means. And that's the good news. We could cut or melt or blast our way in if we wanted to, so these things can be destroyed. It means we have a fighting chance if they ever turn bad on us. Though, I don't think it'd matter. They'd probably just drop some rocks on our heads and wait for the ice age to end. We're like schoolyard kids armed with pebbles against these things. We can cut them open and we can shoot them down occasionally. It took a while to pull that thing out of the jungle and get it on a ship back to the States. By the time we opened it, well, have you ever opened a fridge full of food after the power's been out for a few days? The discs are manned. I don't know if these things died on impact or after, but there was nothing alive when we cracked it open. I guess everyone wants to know about these things. I call them things on purpose, not out of disrespect or anything like that. I just don't think any of us were ever convinced they were actually living creatures. Well, not in the sense that you and I are. For one, they don't have much of a digestive system, just enough to process the food they get from the ship itself, kind of like an IV. There is no actual stomach to hold large amounts of food like normal animals. So that kind of made us suspicious that these weren't really what was behind this whole thing. I don't know how many live ones were ever found, but I know that we found 2 alive in one crash. Well, it was less a crash and more of a hard landing. What I mean is this thing was intact with barely any damage and had clearly avoided smashing into the surrounding countryside. But witnesses said there'd been a big flash of light and a loud sound over the mountains. This was in the UK. People had reported seeing something fiery go across the sky all across the UK, but it turns out it was an honest-to-God coincidence. A big meteor had hit a nearby area at the same time that this thing came down. Obviously, the British were in on it along with us and a few other major NATO partners, so we concentrated on getting these things before the Soviets. It was a default agreement that all recovered materials went back to the US, which made the Europeans a bit sore, but that's the price you pay to have a superpower watching your back, I guess. Anyway, we were pretty sure at least on a few occasions they snagged a few bits for themselves. Back to these things. The second disc, which actually was my first ever, sorry I should have kept them in chronological order for you, had a crew of 5, only 2 were alive. The strange thing is, we had no idea what killed the other 3. There was only some bruising on their bodies from what we assume was the hard landing, but nothing serious. By the way, the typical gray alien description that people give is pretty close to on the money. Not quite, but very close. They're a little taller than people think, and the eyes aren't quite as big as people draw, but they are big, which tells us they grew up in a low-light environment. All their ships were dimly lit on the inside. I don't know why people who claim to be abducted talk about brightly lit rooms. We never saw any of that. It was dim enough inside these ships to see, but it wasn't comfortable. Maybe these people who say they were abducted are just remembering things wrong. One thing we figured out quickly is they can mess with your head, mess with the way you perceive things. Anyway, the 2 live ones. They weren't injured or anything, just kind of stared at us once the ship opened. The program has strict protocols because we're always expecting to make contact with non-human intelligence, and there are very strict protocols on what to do and what not to do. People think we go after these craft gun blazing in full military gear. I mean, yeah, when I did security for the program, we were heavily armed. We never knew what we were up against or if a foreign team would show up. That happened once or twice. But the security people are on the outside, well away from the craft. Think about it. These things are smart enough to cross the galaxy or come from wherever they come from. Do you really want to show up and send soldiers first? No. We first take readings to ensure there's nothing toxic or hazardous. Then we send in medical personnel. The lead doc we call the ambassador. He had special training for contact protocols in case we ran into something living and talking. The ambassador always spoke at least English, Russian, Chinese, and Spanish, the most prevalent human languages, and I think also things like American Sign Language, though just to be aware of how to speak with body gestures. Not that we expected them to know ASL. So we kept the guys with the guns well back, out of sight if we could. It was a risk. Maybe these things would shoot up the medical team, or maybe there's a space monster in there. But it was a better risk than starting an interstellar war or scaring the hell out of them with armed grunts. That night, the 2 live ones apparently just kind of stood there as the team entered the craft. It had opened on its own. Maybe they opened the door. I don't know if it was open when we got there. They stood there and they didn't answer the ambassador at all. Basically, they just barely reacted to anything. Just basic stimuli like turning their heads away from bright lights. They didn't even object when the medical team started looking them over for injuries, or so I was told. I saw them when they were led out of the craft, and I do mean they were led out like children. The medical guys grabbed them by the hand and just let them out like a kid. They just sort of stood where you left them. I was on Overwatch Squad. We'd spread out along the entrance in a U formation and kept in the tree line, again to provide security if they did anything, but not be visible and intimidating. It was a rule that you never leveled your rifle at these things, even if they were corpses or looked like corpses. Just because they appear dead doesn't mean they are. We don't know much about their physiology, you know. So the last thing you want is for them to feel threatened. I never once leveled my rifle at them or their bodies in all my years on the security side. You always kept the weapon at low ready, muzzle pointed to the ground. People got the wrong idea, and they think we're out there snatching these things up and whisking them away for dissection. Let me tell you, we did everything possible to be helpful. We tried to provide medical treatment, but these things always died. Always. They'd live at most another few days, never said a word or reacting to anything, and then they just slump over. Eventually we figured out that they can take in water based on what we found in the ship, and apparently the food, or whatever you call it, was pretty basic protein and other stuff, I don't know, but nothing fancy. So when we figured it out, we started hooking the live ones up to IVs when we could. They have a circulatory system like us. We figured that out from the corpses, but no matter how hard we tried to keep them alive, they always just keeled over eventually. Back to that night though, the things just stood around wherever we guided them. You led one to stand over there and it'd stand there. You move it somewhere else and it stands there. Their limbs are a little long and their knees aren't in the right places, but they would sit on chairs if one was available. Otherwise, they just stand there until they fell over, exhausted. That and the way their organs worked led us to believe that these things are, well, they're basically just drones, like biological computers. Whatever's making these things just creates a biological crew when it needs one, and they do their job and nothing else. At least that was our theory, because their bodies didn't seem built to last, and the eggheads found it suspicious that they were able to breathe our atmosphere so easily. What are the odds that space aliens would also be able to breathe our exact atmosphere? Plus, we never found anything we'd call personal items on the interiors, ever. There were no drawers full of spare clothing, nothing that looked like it was for entertainment, not even a sleeping area. I don't know if they had to go to the bathroom. Again, a lot of information was compartmentalized, But when I moved to the administrative side of things, you can't stop people from talking. And in truth, the program wanted us to talk, at least those of us who were seniors, because it provided an outlet. You sit on something like this, and you have no one to talk to about it or ponder what this whole thing is, and it eats you up inside. They found that out the hard way in the early days, so they relaxed about how compartmentalized everything was once you'd achieve senior status. Plus, I think they wanted us to share ideas. It's a giant mystery, and people need to share ideas to figure it out. So these things, the aliens, I guess, are probably just biological computers, basically. That's what we thought. But who knows, maybe they're so alien we just don't understand anything about them. But everything seemed to point to that conclusion. And that was suspicious too, because we recovered craft with no crew. So why did the saucers and one or two other types need a crew? We had a theory. Again, I've been out of it for over 20 years, so maybe they know stuff now we didn't back then. But we had a theory in my time that this was all being fabricated for us. We actually tasked NASA to look for where something like a big 3D printer could be in the solar system. Some facility or computer just making these crafts and these things and sending them to Earth. And sometimes they crashed or they just landed and didn't take off. Like whatever was doing this wanted us to recover the craft. I don't know if they ever found anything, though there was some excitement for a while. It's hard to hide heat in space, and obviously making these crafts on such a large scale would give off a lot of heat. Or maybe not. Maybe they use physics we don't even understand. I never felt that these things were a threat. The security teams were really more to keep other people out for whatever was in the craft. But I know that sometimes they defended themselves. The Iranians tried to shoot one down, and it didn't go well for them. We tried too, but it didn't go well for us either. I think we got a little better at it, and I know we did down one or two in the 90s, but only because there was a legitimate concern over what they were doing. They hurt people sometimes. I don't know if it was on purpose or not. I think it was just a side effect of their presence. But there was a lot of good intelligence that you really don't want to be near one when its power systems are fully online. I said earlier that they can mess with your head, and I don't think that's on purpose either. We were confident that the source of the trouble wasn't the living beings we recovered, because you'd get the same effect when the craft was empty if you got close. Not all the time, but sometimes. People would describe things happening in different ways. Never big, major differences, but enough to be worrying. We had to develop special techniques for handling exposure to these crafts. We called them anchors, a consensus on what is reality. For instance, if you and I were on a security team and approached a craft, we'd say, okay, the craft is resting up against a big oak tree, and there's a gray boulder on the other side. You'd think of that picture, and it would help with the confusion whenever that effect happened, kind of ward it off. I don't know what it was though. Maybe a side effect of the technology, maybe some attempt at communication. It didn't seem a defensive measure to me, but yeah, I'm not surprised when there's a sighting and people see different things. As a matter of fact, I know there have been some high-profile events where people have suffered from this phenomenon. The Hopkinsville Goblins, for instance. Those people were shooting at ghosts, but really there was a craft in the vicinity. It's way back when we were first figuring things out though. As far as what they want, I can't tell you. If anyone figured it out, they didn't share it with me. I don't think they're a threat. We only recently got the tech to even harm these things, and even then it seems more like they're letting us do it. We strongly suspected this whole phenomenon was a form of gifting. Why else would craft crash or just land and then nothing comes to try to recover it? If we had a space mission go bad on Mars, we'd send help if we could. I guess Mars is too far away, but okay, the moon. We could rescue people on the moon if we needed to, and we would, but nobody ever comes for these things. And why are they sometimes landing completely operational and not taking off again? Most of us thought that it was a way of gifting technology without massive disruption to our own evolution. I don't know how much they figured out, and I wonder if they ever managed to even fly one of those things. I do know that from speaking to the eggheads, this technology is so far advanced they couldn't tell the difference between the toilet and the drive system. It'd be like giving a nuclear aircraft carrier to the ancient Romans. Maybe they figured it out by now. I don't know. I don't think so. Or we would see some tremendous technology by now. We had another conclusion though, this one more disturbing. Maybe they just left these crafts lying around because they were easy to build, and they just didn't care because they had a plan to deal with us well before we figured out their technology. Imagine if we accidentally lost an F-14 Tomcat to the ancient Romans fully intact while doing reconnaissance. What would we care if they studied it? By the time they figured out how to even turn the damn thing on, we'd already have dealt with them. So maybe we're getting gifted, Or perhaps we're getting to be dealt with before we're a problem. I don't know. Only time will tell. The US government has harmed or killed people to keep a secret UFO crash recovery program a secret. This is the stunning allegation revealed in the most recent congressional hearing on UFOs, this time with 3 witnesses, one of which claims to have direct knowledge of said crash retrieval program. Here's our breakdown of what exactly went on at this historic meeting. Just in time for the summer blockbusters of Barbie and Oppenheimer, Congress dropped a blockbuster of its own, the first UFO whistleblower congressional briefing to ever take place in the public eye. And here it's important to note that this is the first public hearing because, as the congressmen and women themselves confirm, there have been prior briefings held in secret. The stars of the show were 3 whistleblowers, David Fravor, Ryan Graves, and David Grush. The world had heard from Fravor and Graves before, who were both involved in high-profile UFO/UAP incidents, but Grush is a relative newcomer who dropped his own bombshell in June of 2023. Ryan Graves is a former Navy pilot who between the summer of 2014 and March of 2015 was aboard the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. During this time period, as the carrier's F-18 Super Hornets operated in training exercises from off the coast of Virginia to Florida, they encountered UFOs on a nearly daily basis. According to Graves, sightings became so frequent that soon pilots were no longer surprised, until one nearly collided with an F-18, prompting the Navy to write up an incident report. Graves' unit would go on to record one of the objects zooming over the waves with their forward-looking infrared camera. David Fravor had his own UFO encounter all the way back in 2004 while he was serving aboard the USS Nimitz as commander of a Super Hornet squadron. While on a training flight with his wingwoman, Fravor was notified of the USS Princeton detecting unidentified contacts. The Princeton had just received a new advanced radar, and there was concern that there might be some issues to work out. The objects appeared to be descending from 80,000 feet to sea level in less than a second, prompting the Princeton to request Fravor's flight to check the situation out. Upon arriving at the coordinates, the Super Hornets discovered what would become infamously known as the Tic Tac. Observed by pilots and their weapon system officers, the Tic Tac-like object was the size of a large aircraft, but shaped like the candy, and with no visible flight surfaces. When Fravor dipped his Super Hornet down to take a closer look, the Tic Tac mirrored his movements to maintain separation. When Fravor maneuvered aggressively to cut off the Tic Tac, the object accelerated to hypersonic speeds, appearing 60 miles away on radar less than a minute later. The last of the 3 witnesses, David Grush, has admitted that he's never seen a UFO himself. However, he has seen other things that disturbed him enough to turn whistleblower. Grush was an intelligence officer with the National Geospatial Agency and liaison to the Pentagon's official UAP investigation. In this capacity, he was exposed to multiple personnel whom Grush claims were either a part of or had knowledge of a secret U.S. government program to recover crashed UFOs. Alarmed at the multiple crimes he said he learned of, as well as a complete lack of congressional oversight, Grush briefed the Senate Intelligence Committee, otherwise known as the Gang of Eight, before eventually going public with his claims. Since then, he's been very cagey about what exactly he talks about in a public setting, but he has volunteered multiple times to brief congressmen and women in the appropriate security setting, and as long as they themselves have the proper security clearances. With witnesses set, what exactly went down at this briefing? Grush was questioned about Representative Tim Burchett about his whistleblowing, with Grush confirming that he'd suffered reprisal from within the intelligence community for bringing this information to light. This tracks with what we can verify from Grush. Grush originally broke his story via News Nation, stating that the New York Times was interested but would take too long to publish his story. Grush has never answered why he felt it was important to get his story out fast, with a lesser-known news network, rather than the prestigious New York Times, who broke the original Pentagon UFO investigation as well as the Navy UFO videos back in 2017. It seems, though, that fear of imminent reprisal might have motivated Grush to get his story out to the public as soon as possible. Grush claimed that when he briefed the U.S. Senate about the UFO recovery program, he was immediately harassed and intimidated by members of the intelligence community, claiming that there had even been a break-in to his home. He filed an official complaint with the Inspector General of the intelligence community, who, after a 2-week investigation, wrote a letter stating that it was their opinion that claims about harassment toward Grush from within the U.S. intelligence community were valid. and should be investigated immediately. This is a letter we can verify, as it's part of the public record. So despite refusing to speak on specific details outside of a classified setting, we can verify that someone inside of the US government attempted to harass and intimidate Grush for speaking to Congress about a UFO recovery program. Grush would go on to remain cagey with answers regarding his harassment, as the investigation by the Inspector General is still active. He did state, though, that the harassment he endured was, quote, brutal. Tim Burkett then asked Grush if he had knowledge of people being harmed or killed in order to keep this recovery program a secret. Grush confirmed that it had in fact happened, stating that someone close to him had experienced some form of harassment, although he didn't go into detail with this claim either. Once more, he stated that he would brief Congress in the proper setting, but confirmed that he had given specific information to the Gang of Eight in his closed-door hearing. From here, the convention turned to UAPs and their very nature. Are these objects a threat to the United States? All witnesses confirmed that while they didn't have the knowledge that these objects were actively threatening, their very capabilities made them a significant threat to the United States, potentially the planet, should they turn hostile. In the words of David Fravor, their technology far outstrips anything in the inventory of the United States. When Fravor and Graves were asked if they felt they could have defended themselves with their F-18 Super Hornets, both witnesses agreed that they felt like they would have had no chance. It's interesting to note here that Representative Tim Burkett had previously conducted an interview with John Michael Gauthier on his Event Horizon podcast, where he stated that what he had seen in the classified setting made him feel like these objects could potentially be a threat to the entire world. On the capabilities of these craft, Graves stated that he and his squadron would spot these objects hanging in the sky at zero airspeed, meaning that they were actively resisting the force of up to a Category 4 winds to remain perfectly still relative to the surface of the ocean. However, in the blink of an eye, the objects had the ability to reach up to Mach 1.2 or more and move in very erratic patterns throughout the sky that would significantly damage a living pilot, if not kill them outright. Both Fravor and Graves were of the opinion that current human material science simply couldn't take the stresses of the maneuvers they observed. Fravor would go on to state that what disturbed him the most about the craft he observed was its flight performance. Nothing in the US inventory could match it, and it was clear that if this object ever had a hostile intent, it could have easily destroyed the Super Hornets and killed their crews with impunity. Here we note that in Grush's whistleblower report, he states that he was aware of incidents where military personnel were harmed or possibly killed by hostile acts of UAPs. As usual, he declined to give details that were classified, but the implication is still clear. The US military may have lost lives to the actions of non-human craft. He did also state before this briefing that as part of the UFO recovery program, he was aware of the fact that some personnel involved in the study of these craft had either been killed or harmed. Kinda makes you wonder if the US government has a supply of Class D personnel. After the briefing, investigative journalist George Knapp submitted a letter to the Congressional investigation written to him by a Russian colonel. In the letter, the colonel claims that the Russian aerospace forces had also been involved in hostile events with UFOs after some of their aircraft attempted to shoot them down on numerous occasions. On at least 2 occasions, the UFOs disabled the Russian aircraft somehow, leading to the planes crashing and the death of their pilots. After that, the Russian Ministry of Defense issued a blanket order that pilots were from now on to leave UFOs completely alone, warning that their ability for reprisal could be, quote, catastrophic. As part of the ongoing investigation, multiple senators asked David Grush if he could provide more specific details of where the investigation should look next. Grush confirmed that he could share the names of specific personnel, physical locations, and names of projects to look at, even stating that he could provide a list of both cooperative and hostile witnesses. However, as usual, he could not do so in a public setting. This is a major deal because verifying Grush's story is now only a matter of Congress investigating the locations, personnel, and projects that he claims are involved in the recovery program or have knowledge of it. But this might be trickier than expected because Grush also warned that he was aware of the fact that a number of these recovered craft and materials had been given by the US government to private aerospace companies in order to avoid congressional oversight and freedom of information requests. This took place as far back as the 1950s, and Grush stated that he knew exactly which companies had some of the materials and he'd be willing to share that information. Confirming the claims of conspiracy theorists for the last 7 decades, Grush also confirmed that he was aware of a disinformation campaign undertaken by parts of the government to discredit UFO witnesses and discourage their investigation. He would not speak to the details of this in public, but one need only look at the rich, thriving culture of ridicule surrounding UFOs to see just how effective such a campaign has truly been. We are, after all, living in a world where 4 trained Navy aviators all witnessed a tic-tac object defying the laws of physics, and some random YouTube big brain claims they had simply all misidentified a passenger jet in the distance. And people accepted this answer. Honestly, if we've got combat aviators who can't tell the difference between a craft that violates physics and a 747 on the horizon, then America has Russia levels of problems with the competency of its military. Need more proof of ridicule culture? Here's prominent science educator and general science celebrity Neil deGrasse Tyson ridiculing the Navy's tic-tac video by claiming UFOs are always out of focus, thus insinuating it's nothing more than a prosaic object that's been misidentified. And of course, we're all silly to think otherwise. Meanwhile, Mr. Tyson apparently doesn't realize that the markings on the video, like the elevation deviation lines, are also fuzzy, meaning the entire video is low resolution and likely provided that way by the US Navy because it always de-reses footage from its combat sensors. Further, he fails to account for the 4 trained aviators who spotted the object, because it's easier to make fun of footage than it is to slander 4 highly qualified witnesses. This isn't skepticism, it's denialism. The culture of ridicule has seriously impeded research on the topic, even by the Department of Defense itself, which has admitted that pilots are not reporting UFO sightings for fear of reprisal or ridicule. And this matters a lot, because not every UFO exhibits exotic flight characteristics. Some are just strange and weird, and sometimes these strange and weird craft end up being brand new Russian or Chinese platforms. Thanks to a culture of ridicule, the US has been blindsided by the development of multiple foreign aircraft, many of which have been used as reconnaissance assets very close to US operations. The US Navy and Air Force have moved to establish new UAP reporting guidelines to try to cut through this culture of ridicule, which is becoming a very serious threat to national security. When Graves was asked about the Roosevelt's encounters and how many pilots he believes actually reported their sightings, he said that he believed only 5% of all encounters were ever reported, and often those reports went nowhere. The briefing moved on to who knew what and what they knew. Grush was asked if there were government personnel who knew more about the UFO phenomenon and a possible recovery program than their peers did, and Grush confirmed that there were in fact some elected officials who were privy to much more information than others. This directly led to the question of if the US government had made any formal contact with non-human intelligences. Grush refused to answer this in the positive or the negative, stating that he'd only do so inside of a properly classified briefing. However, Grush did confirm his earlier claims that we are in fact dealing with a non-human intelligence. As part of the crash retrieval program, biological remains were discovered that were non-human in origin. This was the assessment of the people Grush spoke to, who were working or had knowledge of the program. Again, Grush reiterated that he had never seen these objects or the occupants for himself, but that he could provide a list of witnesses, both hostile and cooperative, who had. At this point, Representative Matt Gaetz disclosed his own experience attempting to gain cooperation from the military on a UAP matter. At some point earlier this year, his office received a protected disclosure notification, or a whistleblower report, of an incident that had occurred to personnel at Eglin Air Force Base. Gaetz would go on to confirm that a U.S. surveillance aircraft out on a training flight had encountered a formation of UAPs flying in a diamond formation. Approaching them to take a closer look, his radar and FLIR equipment both malfunctioned and the pilot was forced to take a photograph of one of the objects manually. However, when Gaetz arrived at Eglin Air Force Base, he was not allowed to meet with the flight crew, was denied the radar tapes showing the 4 contacts in flight, and was denied access to the photographs taken by the pilot. Gaetz had to use his congressional authority to force military personnel to allow him to speak with part of the crew. And while he was still denied the radar tapes, he was allowed to see one of the photographs taken by the pilot, prompting Gaetz to state that what he was looking at was, quote, something I am not able to attach to any human capabilities. Later, Gaetz was told by military test pilots that there was an unspoken code of conduct in the community. You don't report UAPs, and if you see one, then, quote, the best thing to do is to forget about it. After the hearing, Representative Burkett would confirm that he had talked to pilots who stated they often destroyed evidence of UAPs from their aircraft systems just to avoid even bringing the issue up. After the briefing was concluded, to the shock of nobody, the intelligence community denied the congressional investigation the use of an SCIF, or Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. An SCIF is where the U.S. military and government speaks about the most sensitive of matters. The most highly classified information can only be discussed in one of these specially constructed facilities. Their size can vary from a phone booth-sized room to the entire floor of a building. Their walls are made of material that prevents any form of electromagnetic eavesdropping, and the walls and door are built with reinforced metal mesh or metal studs to prevent forced break-ins. Soundproofing material and acoustic sealant makes it impossible to hear anything from the outside, and the doors feature deadbolts, combination locks, and access control systems. To prevent acoustic weak points, wiring runs along the wall rather than flush with it, and vents allowing air in can only be of a maximum size and protected by metal bars. All cell phones and other unsecured electronic devices are strictly banned, and they have motion sensors to detect movement when not in use. Indications are the congressional investigation is prepared and willing to enact the Holman Rule if they continue to be denied access to an SCIF to hear Grush's testimony completely unredacted. The Holman Rule is a congressional tool meant to help ensure power over the federal government. It allows Congress to reduce the salary of specific federal employees, fire them outright, and even gut entire federal programs. But the real question is why the intelligence community is denying the use of the SCIF in the first place. If Grush's testimony is just more conspiracy theory nonsense, as many believe, then why is the intelligence community interested in A. harassing him directly, and B. denying Congress the means by which to hear his testimony? Even more worryingly, why is the intelligence community blocking legislation that would mandate that UAP reports by commercial airline pilots be made immediately available to Congress? And where does the intelligence community get the authority to block legislation by the people it's supposed to be working for? There's something strange in the skies over the Earth, operating from the Southeast Pacific to the Middle East, and even here in the American homeland. The United States military has encountered unexplained aerial phenomenon that even its best fighters and air defense systems have failed to identify or bring down. Now the United States Congress, in a historically unprecedented move, is demanding answers from the Department of Defense. What exactly is in our skies? UFOs and military involvement is nothing new, with the American military swept right into controversy when an unidentified object crashed into a rancher's land in Roswell, New Mexico back in 1947. The crashed item would without question turn out to be a specialized weather balloon, but perhaps fearing the leaking of information on a very sensitive and top-secret program to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, Public Information Officer Walter Haut made the blunder of the century when he dictated a press release that the Army had discovered a crashed flying disc. This massive blunder would go on to entangle the U.S. military with UFOs for decades to come, and ardent believers to this day still hold on to the belief that there really was an alien disc at Roswell, despite the rancher who had discovered the item reporting that he discovered wreckage made of, quote, rubber strips, tinfoil, paper, and sticks. He'd only start thinking about UFOs when he heard one of the many popular flying disc stories at the time. Other details, including bodies and material with magical properties, would all end up being reported secondhand. Nonetheless, while Roswell may have been a top-secret weather balloon, Americans were definitely seeing strange things in the sky. In 1952, a series of highly publicized UFO incidents over Washington, D.C. led to growing national paranoia, fueled by the highly misleading facts propagated by national newspaper chains. With fear over UFOs reaching a fever pitch, the U.S. government consolidated several investigations into one single program codenamed Project Blue Book. This investigation would run until December 17, 1969, when the program was canceled after not discovering any credible threat to the United States of America. While Project Blue Book found that people were terrible eyewitnesses and that nearly all sightings could be explained by misidentification or natural phenomenon, the final report did admit that a small percentage of sightings were both impossible to explain and had credible witnesses. Despite this and the growing sightings of UFOs in sensitive military sites, such as nuclear weapons storage depots and ICBM fields, the official investigation was over. Then in 2020, because seriously, when else would this have happened, the doors on the UFO phenomenon were blown open once more by the shocking admission of the United States military that its fighter aircraft had indeed tracked unidentified aerial phenomenon. In a massive blow to the conspiracy theorists who claim the U.S. government actively hides evidence of UFOs, the Department of Defense declassified 3 different videos of UFOs being investigated by American fighters. This was followed by the announcement that the Navy was installing formal guidelines for its pilots to report encounters with UFOs. All the press attention also revealed the existence of a then classified program run by the Department of Defense between 2007 and 2012 meant to study unidentified aerial phenomenon. The head of this classified program would himself go on to say the following about his findings. These aircraft, we'll call them aircraft, are displaying characteristics that are not currently within the U.S. inventory, nor in any foreign inventory that we are aware of. Once more adding fuel to the UFO fire was the revelation that in 2019, U.S. senators received a classified briefing on UFOs by Navy leadership, with the spokesman for the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations stating, Navy officials did indeed meet with interested congressional members and staffers to provide a classified brief on efforts to understand and identify these threats to the safety and security of our aviators, painting the UFO phenomenon as a concern to the safety of pilots. The statement may have inadvertently admitted that something was in fact being encountered by American military and civilian pilots, even if it necessarily isn't of alien origin. Given that the U.S. recently confirmed it had already flown a prototype 6th-generation fighter aircraft, we can only imagine that part of the reason so many of these UFO investigations have remained classified is because of the need to maintain secrecy around extremely sensitive weapon systems being tested by the U.S. military, some of which have likely been spotted by civilians who no doubt thought they were looking at alien aircraft, similar to the way that the flight tests of the B-2 bomber and F-117 during the 80s led to an avalanche of UFO reports. Yet it seems that the American Congress is not satisfied with the answers it's received so far, and now it's official. The American military has 180 days from the start of 2021 to give a detailed and complete disclosure on the UFO phenomenon. For conspiracy theorists everywhere, it's time to rejoice, as the congressional mandate dictates that the report must be unclassified and thus available to the public. The report instructs various intelligence agencies and the military to analyze in detail UFO data and intelligence gathered by the Office of Naval Intelligence and now defunct Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force and the FBI. UFO reports are actually nothing new, with curious congressmen and women occasionally tucking in provisions for mandatory briefs on the phenomenon into funding bills. Yet this report is different, as it's the most comprehensive gathering of interagency data on UFOs since Project Blue Book. It also formally establishes an interagency process to both gather and analyze future unidentified aerial phenomenon and report on these findings to the federal government. The report also mandates that any potential threats to national security posed by UFOs should be identified and calls on the American intelligence community to assess whether any potential foreign adversary, such as China or Russia, are behind the UFO phenomenon. Before you get your hopes too high though, while the report's mandated to be unclassified and thus accessible to the public, Congress approved the inclusion of a classified annex. This doesn't necessarily mean that any specific information on UFOs is being kept secret, but rather is a necessary measure for such a comprehensive report to be possible in the first place. Such a detailed report on UFOs is going to include highly classified details, such as intelligence sources in foreign governments and the testing and capabilities of next-generation weapon systems, which may have led to UFO sightings themselves. It will no doubt also include highly classified details of America's most sophisticated tracking systems, all information the U.S. would not want its adversaries to get their hands on. This report certainly comes at an auspicious time, with, in late 2020, the former head of the Israeli space program publicly announcing that the U.S. and Israeli governments were in cooperation with extraterrestrials. The statement, coming from such a highly placed government official and credible witness, was sadly largely lost on a public completely focused on COVID-19 and an explosive presidential election. For believers in our visitation by aliens from outer space, though, these two almost back-to-back developments signal at a greater plan to slowly indoctrinate the public to the reality that UFOs are real and aliens have been visiting us for decades. We just have to be prepared for the formal announcement by the slow disclosure of evidence to their existence. If that's true, then there's gonna come a pretty big blow to the poor nerds who've been wasting their time poring over boring computer data over at Breakthrough Listen, the multi-million-dollar privately funded program that's focused on eavesdropping on the electronic signals of alien life out in the universe. After half a year of anticipation and a slew of very high-profile incidents involving military ships and aircraft, the Pentagon has finally released a congressionally mandated report on unidentified flying objects, and what's inside the report has sent shockwaves around the world. Keep watching as we unpack the entire recently released UFO report page by page. Shortly after World War II, UFO sightings began to explode across the world. World War II pilots themselves had reported UFOs as well. nicknaming them Foo Fighters. But UFOs went mainstream after several high-profile incidents in the late 1940s and 50s. The first was Kenneth Arnold's UFO sighting, where he spotted multiple flying discs in formation, moving several hundred miles an hour faster than his aircraft was capable of. Then, there was the alleged Roswell crash, which, while has been thoroughly debunked by now, still served to spark the public's imagination. Then came the UFO invasion of Washington, D.C., with multiple bright objects spotted hovering over the nation's capital. The U.S. military was immediately tasked with getting to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon, leading to the creation of several investigative bodies that culminated with Project Blue Book, an official and all-encompassing investigation into the UFO phenomenon. Project Blue Book was canceled in 1969 after analyzing over 12,000 UFO reports. Its final conclusion was stark. No UFO the project investigated ever posed a threat to national security. No UFO investigated ever exhibited technology beyond the scope of what was at the time modern scientific knowledge, and there was no evidence that any sighting that remained unidentified was in fact extraterrestrial in origin. Yet Project Blue Book did generate just over 700 incidents that the investigative body could not explain. Some of those incidents were truly hair-raising and included numerous highly credible witnesses, such as the encounter of a UFO over a CIA-funded uranium mine in Africa, reported by a former World War II fighter pilot who was deemed extremely competent by the CIA agents sent to debrief him, or the numerous reports of hovering UFOs over American nuclear weapons storage depots and missile fields, with positive contact on local radar and multiple on-the-ground eyewitnesses amongst the security and maintenance personnel. Perhaps even more chillingly, shortly after the Cold War ended and the Iron Curtain around Eastern Europe fell, came the discovery that extremely similar incidents had been occurring in Soviet missile fields and nuclear facilities as well. Officially, the government stopped investigating UFOs. Unofficially, small internal investigations took place throughout the years as the UFO phenomenon continued to be reported by both civilians and military personnel, though those investigations were more concerned with discovering advanced Russian or Chinese technology and not aliens. Then, in the early 2010s, Nevada Senator Harry Reid secured funding for an unidentified aerial phenomenon program tasked with investigating UFO reports. This would lead to the leaking of several pieces of very high-profile video as U.S. fighter jets encountered strange flying objects off the east and west coasts. Then came a shocking discovery earlier this year. While it was believed that the UAP program had been terminated, the U.S. military had recently restarted an unacknowledged investigation into phenomenon. Early in 2021, the U.S. Congress mandated that the Pentagon had 6 months to prepare a report on its findings on the UAP phenomenon, and that it should be as unclassified as possible so it would be readily available to the American people. A separate classified copy of the report does exist, but that's only because this copy of the report deals with the technical details of America's most advanced weapon and sensor systems. So, what does the Pentagon's UFO report say? First, this is only a preliminary report, as the Department of Defense Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force continues to operate and investigate the UAP phenomenon. The report begins with an acknowledgement as such, and states that the Pentagon's future goals is to enhance training of U.S. military personnel so that they can better report encounters with UAPs and thus help American intelligence services assess a potential threat. This likely means that after decades of discouraging soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines from reporting strange things in the sky, a much more open culture of sharing UAP incidents will be created to facilitate the job of the UAP task force. Interestingly, the report also acknowledges that there will be a concerted effort to develop new technologies for the documenting of UAPs. Before moving on, the report states that overwhelmingly sensors which have captured UAP analyzed by the task force were assumed to be operating correctly, though there is an acknowledgement that some UAP incidents could be attributed to malfunctioning sensors. Next, in the executive summary, the report makes very clear declarations that the UAP task force simply lacked enough high-quality reporting to draw a firm conclusion on the nature or intent of UAPs. Due to a culture that discouraged service members from reporting UAPs, as well as a lack of high-tech sensor assets, the task force had to limit their investigation to reports between 2004 and 2021, and acknowledges that a new system of reporting UAP needs to be established to better assist investigators in their task of discovering the nature and intent of UAPs. Shockingly, though, the report then makes the following conclusion. Most of the UAP reported probably do represent physical objects, given that a majority of UAP were registered across multiple sensors, to include radar, infrared, electro-optical, weapon seekers, and visual observation. What this means is that a significant portion of UAPs investigated by the task force were deemed to be real physical objects, verified by their observation across several different mediums of detection simultaneously. So much for glowing swamp gas. The report moves on to acknowledge what UFO eyewitnesses have been stating for years, that in a small number of incidents investigated, the UAP exhibited very unusual flight characteristics. One recent U.S. Navy encounter, for instance, documented on radar, showed several UAPs plummeting from 50,000 feet to sea level in seconds before shooting back up to even greater heights. According to the UAP Task Force, UAPs could likely be resolved to one of 5 categories: airborne clutter, natural atmospheric phenomenon, U.S. government and U.S. industry developmental programs, foreign adversary systems, and the catch-all, other. The task force is of course mostly interested in the final 2 categories, foreign adversary systems and other, as both could pose a significant threat to the United States of America. The report goes on to state that UAPs without a doubt pose a safety risk to both military and civilian flight, and a challenge to U.S. national security. If UAPs are alien in origin, then that would be an obvious threat to not just the US but global security. However, the task force is most concerned with the possibility that UAPs are evidence that a potential adversary has developed a breakthrough or disruptive technology which the United States does not understand and cannot counter. Given how the US has used both breakthrough and disruptive technologies in war to devastating effect against its adversaries, the fear of such a technology being employed against the US is understandably great. The report moves past the executive summary and into the details of the 6-month investigation. Right off the bat, the UAP Task Force tackles the greatest challenge that it faced in completing its investigation, namely, that reports were hardly ever formally filed by UAP witnesses. This is due to a variety of reasons, such as the lack of a formal reporting procedure for UAP phenomena, which changed with the Navy adopting said procedures in 2019 and the Air Force in 2020. In the future, the UAP Task Force is hopeful that improved reporting procedures will lead to better quality reports. However, the task force's greatest difficulty in collecting good data was something that UFO eyewitnesses have known for decades. Eyewitnesses of unidentified aerial phenomenon hardly, if ever, spoke up about their experience for fear of ridicule or ostracization. The task force's report, though, states that as senior military, government, and scientific leadership begins to engage in the topic publicly, the stigma of reporting strange encounters should lessen, leading to better data collected. Another difficulty the task force encountered was that despite having very sophisticated sensor systems in the U.S. military are typically designed to fulfill a very specific role, and that often means they're not very useful for identifying UAPs. This is likely why the report began with the acknowledgement that new technologies needed to be developed for the specific purpose of investigating UAPs. The report moves on to state that the reports investigated had too little data to allow for detailed trend or pattern analysis. However, there was a noticeable consistency in the size, shape, and propulsion of UAPs. This is a stunning conclusion, as if UAPs were merely the figments of one's imagination or random natural phenomenon, there would not be a strong consistency in the way UAPs look, how big they are, and how fast they move. The report goes on to state that UAP sightings also tend to be cluttered around U.S. military training and testing grounds. This goes hand in hand with a theory long held that whatever they are, UAPs are very interested in the state of our military technology, or it could be an indicator that these are very much foreign adversary systems being used to spy on U.S. forces. However, the task force acknowledges that this cluttering of UAP sightings around U.S. military training and testing grounds could simply be due to collection bias, as those areas have a high concentration of sophisticated sensors and an expectation and guidance by personnel involved to report any anomaly. Now, the report drops another bombshell. Out of the hundreds of incidents investigated thus far, the task force identified 18 incidents where UAPs were witnessed performing aerial maneuvers that would signify advanced technology was in use. These UAPs were recorded hovering in place, moving against the wind, performing extremely abrupt changes in speed or direction, and displaying extremely high velocities without any known means of propulsion. In a small number of these incidents, U.S. aircraft also detected radio frequency energy emanating from the objects. Some of the UAPs observed also displayed some degree of signature management or purposeful manipulation of their own electromagnetic emissions. In modern militaries, signature management is a critical era of warfighting, with friendly forces doing their best to screen their electromagnetic signatures from adversaries while making them identifiable to allies. This would imply that UAPs are employing the same form of electromagnetic security measures that modern earthbound militaries do. The task force states that more rigorous examination of the collected data by experts is necessary to ascertain if this is in fact what UAPs have been recorded doing or not, and ends this section by stating, that the UAPTF will continue further analysis to determine if these incidents are proof of breakthrough technologies. From here, the report once more states that more data is required to determine the identity of UAP incidents investigated, with special attention needed on those incidents where UAPs are shown to display flight characteristics which would be indicative of breakthrough technologies or signature management, which would be indicative of intelligent control over an artificial object. In their investigation, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force was not able to attribute any of these incidents investigated to classified U.S. weapons programs. The report moves on to declare that UAPs pose a definitive threat to flight operations and could be a potential national security risk. In 11 instances, pilots reported near misses with UAPs. Touching on the potential for UAPs posing a national security threat, the report states that the task force has initiated an effort to identify any potential technological breakthroughs by potential adversaries, namely China and Russia. This likely means that significant U.S. intelligence resources are also being redirected to the effort, as now the intelligence community joins the hunt to explain UAPs. Given the proximity of UAP to U.S. military facilities and to aircraft carrying the military's most advanced sensor systems, the report seems to indicate that a high priority should be placed on discovering if a potential adversary has in fact developed and fielded a disruptive or breakthrough technology. Because if they have, it's clear the U.S. military is all but powerless to counter it. Finally, the report ends with a call for more resources and better reporting procedures across the American government and military of UAPs. So, does the U.S. military believe that alien UFOs are cruising the skies above our heads? Simply put, no. But the report does acknowledge that a significant number of credible UFO incidents investigated by the UAP task force display instances of technology that would be beyond the scope of what's currently possible. The UAPTF's greatest concern, however, remains that it's not aliens but a potential adversary, which is flying close to our most sensitive military installations, and we're all but helpless to stop it. The United States and other nations are involved in a secret arms race involving recovered alien technology. And before you laugh this video off as another conspiracy theory tall tale, you should know that this time, the source is one of the most credible to ever step forward. UFOs, or UAPs like the cool kids call them, are real. There's no longer any debate on the phenomenon. Any skepticism to their existence is only an excuse to reconcile one's own worldview with the emotionally uncomfortable conclusion that something is flying around in our skies. What exactly this something is, however, is still up for debate. The U.S. government's official investigation into the phenomenon has reached its highest level yet, with multiple open and closed-door briefings to the U.S. Congress. In July 2022, the Defense Department kickstarted a new and very serious investigation into the UAP/UFO phenomenon with the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. The stated goal of this new investigation is to resolve what UAPs are, who is behind them, and if they pose any threat to national security. The last publicly known investigation into the matter, Project Blue Book, was initiated in March 1952 and ran until December 1969. It too was launched in response to a rising number of UFO reports and evolved from Project Sign, set up in 1947. With fears of war and with the communists on the rise, so too were fears of Russian Wunderwaffe. But the rising reports of seemingly extraterrestrial encounters grew to a slowly smoldering panic that the government felt pressure to address. Many people already feared a Soviet nuclear attack, and the government also feared the Soviets could somehow exploit the UFO craze to deliver a sneak-first strike against the U.S. The investigation looked at thousands of UFO reports from civilian and military sources, though it was the military reports that the investigation staff was most interested in. In 1969, the entire effort was summed up in what would come to be known as the infamous Condon Report, which concluded that UFOs were not worth further study. The Condon Report highlighted the following key findings. Number 1. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force was ever an indication of a threat to our national security. Number 2. There was no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represented technological developments or principles beyond the range of modern scientific knowledge. And number 3, there was no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified were extraterrestrial vehicles. However, the report met with immediate controversy after it was discovered that the scientist in charge of the investigation, physicist Edward Condon, had joked about the UFO phenomenon being all a flap. But he wasn't supposed to reach that conclusion until the end of the formal investigation. This seriously undermined Condon's credibility as an academic, as it was clear he was biased and not acting on scientific principles during the investigation. Further criticism arose in 1967 from a memo leaked where one of the investigators assured colleagues that they could expect the study to conclude that UFO observations had no basis in reality. The formal investigation into UFOs was biased from the start. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer hired by the Air Force to investigate UFOs starting with Project Sign, had initially been deeply skeptical of the phenomenon, until the evidence changed his mind. He called the report unscientific and avoidant of the inevitable conclusion that there were still a significant number of UFO encounters that could not be explained, over 700 in fact. The official investigation into UFOs was shuttered, but it seems the official government interest in the phenomenon continued. Despite this, a culture of ridicule has pervaded the topic and been extremely useful for silencing witnesses. And only now, with U.S. supremacy challenged by the rising power of China, is that culture being retracted. According to the official UAP investigation, this culture of ridicule has actively hampered efforts to investigate UAPs as pilots and other witnesses are intimidated into remaining quiet. Given that some of these UAPs could represent advanced foreign adversary threats, the U.S. military has done a full 180 on its protocols on reporting UFOs and UAPs, with the Navy and Air Force both issuing new guidelines to their aviators and encouraging them to come forward. The new investigation into UAPs, AARO, is yielding reams of data, though much of it remains classified. However, it is now known that UAPs have been detected by U.S. military forces in the air, on the land, and even under the sea. Fears of an advanced foreign threat or a leapfrog technology that could render the U.S. vulnerable to attack are partly driving this new investigation, but so is a serious and growing concern for the safety of American civil and military aircraft, given many near misses reported. So far, the investigation has mirrored Project Blue Book, with the vast majority of cases being identified and explained as man-made or a natural phenomenon. However, there remains a disturbing amount of unresolved incidents. However, there's no indication yet that UAPs are alien in origin, though the AARO has confirmed that some of these unknown objects were physical in nature. We could simply just be dealing with an unknown force of nature we've yet to understand. But one whistleblower has come forward with a bombshell of a story, and he might be the most credible whistleblower to date. David Grush served with the U.S. Air Force before separating and taking a job with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, then transitioning to the National Reconnaissance Office. At the NRO, Grush served as Senior Intelligence Capabilities Interrogation Officer, where he worked as the NRO's senior-most technical advisor for unidentified aerial phenomenon analysis transmedium issues, at least according to him. He was also the NRO's representative to the official UAP investigation between 2019 and 2021. After that, he transitioned back to the NGA, but continued working on UAPs alongside the official UAP investigation and the NGA's own efforts in the area. Now comes the bombshell. According to Grush, the U.S. military has been actively recovering debris from UFOs for decades, starting in the post-World War II era. Even more incredibly, the U.S. has recovered fully intact vehicles. When asked about pilots, he commented cryptically that when dealing with vehicles designed to carry beings, that sometimes those beings were still inside of them at the time of recovery. But the U.S. isn't alone in the effort, as according to Grush, multiple countries have been involved in attempts to recover crashed alien craft. Apparently, the U.S. has been the most successful, however. That's probably a good thing, though we imagine Russia would still manage to bungle the Ukraine invasion even if it was armed with Imperial Star Destroyers, mostly because the conscripts would have stripped it of copper for vodka money. The government's been keeping this crash retrieval process a secret from even Congress itself. It accomplishes this by hiding recovery efforts within multiple agencies involved in UAP activities and the use of secret access programs. Basically, the U.S. government avoids congressional accountability by hiding agencies tasked with recovering UAPs within other agencies, sort of like Russian nesting dolls. Given that secret special access programs have incredibly limited oversight already, even at the highest levels of power, it would be easy to hide these efforts from Congress. Efforts to build the B-2 was at one point part of a special access program, and this classification is reserved only for the absolutely most critical of U.S. secrets. Grush claims that the world is involved in a silent arms race to exploit and develop new technologies based off of crashed alien junk. The U.S. enjoys the efforts of allies and defense contractors in its attempt to retrieve these downed craft, and one can hope that if what Grush says is true, NATO is at least in the lead when it comes to fielding alien-inspired doomsday weapons. Grush, however, cannot offer any details on these craft of their occupants because, by his own admission, he's never even seen one himself. Instead, Grush says that he became a whistleblower because of the ongoing litany of wrongdoing by people involved in these crash retrieval efforts. Per Grush, he was approached by individuals involved in the UAP efforts who disclosed concerns over things such as contracting against federal acquisition regulations, the suppression of information across industrial base and academia, and other unspecified criminalities. With mounting concerns over the illegalities and violations of federal law taking place within the retrieval efforts, Grush says that he directly approached Congress to warn it of what he called a, quote, publicly unknown Cold War for recovered and exploited physical material, a competition with near-peer adversaries over the years to identify UAP crash landings and retrieve the material for exploitation or reverse engineering to garner asymmetric national defense advantages. How Congress took this news is unknown, but what is known is that what actually happened next directly led to Grush deciding to become a whistleblower, and for once, we have a real paper trail to verify at least part of Grush's story. After bringing the retrieval efforts to Congress, Grush claims that he was the target of a harassment and retaliation campaign perpetrated by individuals inside the DoD involved with these special access programs. In May 2022, the harassment became significant enough that Grush filed a complaint of reprisal with the Inspector General of the intelligence community in May 2022. Here's where the story takes a significant twist from just another conspiracy theory to a very real possibility that Grush is telling the truth. Grush's background has been largely confirmed via several paper trails linking him to various agencies he claimed to work for. Grush is mentioned in multiple DoD publications starting in 2011, and multiple sources have confirmed Grush's credentials and story to the journalists who first published his claims, Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean, the authors of the original 2017 New York Times expose that revealed the then-secret UAP investigation. However, the sources confirming Grush's story have remained anonymous in order to protect their identities, yet retired Army Colonel Carl Nell was quick to come forward to vouch for Grush's character and his credibility. Nell would make his own explosive revelation in defense of Grush, stating his assertion concerning the existence of a terrestrial arms race occurring sub rosa over the past 80 years, focused on reverse engineering technologies of unknown origins, is fundamentally correct, as is the indisputable realization that at least some of these technologies of unknown origin derive from non-human intelligence. But even more incredibly, we have confirmation that Grush really did file the complaint to the Inspector General of the intelligence community, and their conclusion 1 month later that his complaint was discovered to be, quote, credible and urgent. And unlike other whistleblowers, Grush did not come forward alone. He hired the Compass Rose legal group to represent him as he broke the story, and is represented by Charles McCullough III, who just so happens to himself be a former Inspector General of the intelligence community serving in 2011. Grush is likely to be the single most credible whistleblower on the UFO phenomenon to ever come forward, not just because of his credentials, but the paper trail to back up at least some of his claims. And people are taking note. The House Oversight Committee is even now planning a hearing on UFOs based off Grush's allegations, with the intent of discovering if the Pentagon is indeed keeping secrets from Congress. Per Oversight Committee spokesman Austin Hacker, in addition to recent claims by a whistleblower, reports continue to surface regarding unidentified anomalous phenomena. The House Oversight Committee is following these UAP reports and is in the early stages of planning a hearing. Grush's story is causing serious ripples across the Department of Defense and American culture itself, but it's still in the very early breaking stages, and by the time you see this video, there could be even more explosive revelations. However, it's important to remember that Grush has no physical evidence of any of his claims, and one cannot dispel the possibility that this is all a very elaborate and well-built ruse. U.S. intelligence has long used UFO reports as a cover for top-secret programs, such as the F-117 and the B-2 bomber. It's also an incredibly imaginative community. During the Cold War, the CIA faked a series of vampire attacks in the Philippines in order to scare communist guerrillas, and by all accounts, the effort paid off in spades. So, during a time of rising tensions with China, a near-peer competitor, it's not a stretch to imagine a world where the US government purposefully fabricates a very believable story about recovered alien technology. Grush could be telling the truth, but he also could be a misinformation agent involved in one hell of a ruse. To see the value of such a ruse, try to imagine yourself in China's shoes as very credible news of, quote, multiple nations recovering UFOs and reverse engineering their technology come to light. Imagine that as China, when you look at your own hangars, there's not a single crashed UFO in sight. Suddenly, the fear of the US wielding hyper-advanced weaponry based off recovered alien technology is very real, and you might end up rethinking your approach to international conflicts with America. However, to play devil's advocate, we also have to ask just how many more very well-placed and very credible individuals have come forward before we start accepting that there may be more truth than fable to stories of the US recovering crashed alien craft. In the early 2000s, American fighter jets flying off the coast of California encountered something strange. A small, pill-shaped object was observed to be close to the ocean's surface, possibly rising up out of the water and flying high up into the sky. Giving chase, the F-14 pilots were completely blown away by the strange craft's incredible speeds. Ever since the release of this and other videos captured by American fighter pilots of strange UFOs, speculation has swirled around their true identity. The flight characteristics of the craft in these videos are truly incredible, and if radar reports are to be believed, their acceleration abilities puts them light years ahead of any earthly military tech. However, in 2019, investigative journalists discovered patents filed by the United States Navy, and one of those included a craft capable of recreating the same feats witnesses have been reporting for years. Dubbed the UFO Patents for the incredibly advanced nature of the technology they claim to make possible, this series of patents run the gamut, from room temperature superconductors to an aircraft capable of traveling through the ocean, the air, and space in the same flight, and even more far-fetched, truly science fiction ideas like an electromagnetic field generator that could be used as a force field. If these ideas sound completely far-fetched and out in left field, you're not alone, with the U.S. Patent Office initially refusing to file these patents until the United States Navy stepped in and forced the issue. Crazy patent ideas are nothing new. Everything from perpetual motion machines to wireless transmission of energy devices have been patented from time to time, and not one of them have ever achieved what they claim to be capable of. However, none of these patents had the backing of the United States Navy, and none of them came from top scientists working on some of the Navy's most sensitive research and development programs. The man behind these revolutionary patents is a Dr. Salvatore Cesar Pais, and unlike most garage wannabe Ricks, this doctor has some serious credentials. He's worked at the Naval Air Warfare Center for years, developing aerospace technologies to be used both on jet fighters and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Today, Dr. Pais works for the U.S. Navy Strategic Systems Programs, which is responsible for the U.S. Navy's nuclear missiles and ballistic missile submarines that carry them. However, this office also investigates a wide range of global strike technologies, including a hypersonic weapon now in development that could strike any target in the world within an hour. Not much else is known about Dr. Pais, who has declined interviews on his patents. Other scientists have reviewed the filed patents and claim they violate the laws of physics and call them absurd. Yet that doesn't change the fact that the U.S. Navy has so far stuck to its guns in support of these patents. And what's more, leaked internal emails show that at least one of these revolutionary ideas was already prototyped and tested successfully. First, though, let's go over all of Dr. Pais's patents. By far, the most eye-catching patent is for a craft that, if it performs as stated, would very closely mirror the flight characteristics often observed from UFOs by eyewitnesses. Named the Hybrid Underwater Aerospace Craft, this vehicle comes equipped with an inertial mass reduction device, which we suppose is what would allow the craft to perform the incredible feats of acceleration and maneuverability Dr. Pius claims it's capable of, able to launch from land or from underwater, fly into the ocean, back out, and up into space. This man-made UFO would not just revolutionize air warfare, it would instantly make every other nation's fighter and bomber fleets obsolete. By generating a quantum vacuum state around itself, the craft repels air and water molecules, essentially completely ignoring the effects of friction. As an added benefit, the craft would be almost undetectable, or at least fly too fast to make detection completely meaningless. Another of Dr. Pius's patents include room temperature superconductors, which in and of themselves would be a revolutionary scientific leap for mankind. Current superconductors must operate at extremely low temperatures, greatly losing efficiency as they warm up. This has prevented their use in anything but extremely niche and very expensive technologies. Room temperature superconductors promise to change all that. Able to transmit electricity without resistance, superconductors would create an energy revolution, dramatically lowering the price of electricity. These superconductors would make incredible breakthroughs in maglev mass transit technology and magnetic resonance imaging, among a host of other revolutionary effects on human society. Interestingly, Dr. Pius's all-American UFO depends on room temperature superconductors to operate. Dr. Pius's third patent is for a high-frequency gravity wave generator, a device which, if possible, seems to indicate Pius and the U.S. Navy know more about the fundamental nature of gravity than the global physics community. Gravity waves pass through us from time to time, typically as a result of two massive stars crashing into each other millions of light years away. These gravity waves could be considered very low frequency though, and what Dr. Pius's patent proposes is the generation of very high-frequency gravity waves, which can have a wide range of applications. As gravity waves propagate, they compress matter in front of them and expand it behind them in the same way a surf wave does to water. The waves that occasionally wash over our planet from far away in space are so low frequency that even just detecting them requires one of the most sensitive instruments mankind has ever built. Yet if you were to generate gravity waves of a high enough frequency, you could potentially wreak havoc on anything you aimed your gravity wave gun at, destroying even the most well-protected and armored installation. In Dr. Pius's patent, though, he claims that he can use this high-frequency gravity wave generator to facilitate superconductivity, and perhaps this is the secret behind his room temperature superconductors. As if the previous three patents weren't outlandish enough, Dr. Pius's third patent could literally save the Earth, or destroy it. His electromagnetic field generator is claimed to be able to deflect or destroy an asteroid over the 100-meter size limit that current asteroid deflection methods are thought to be able to protect the Earth from. By generating an extremely powerful electromagnetic field that can interact with an object at the quantum level, Dr. Pius's asteroid destroyer could obliterate an incoming asteroid. Or as his patent very ominously describes, the present invention may also deflect or destroy any other type of object. However, Dr. Pius's asteroid death ray is more than an offensive weapon, as he claims that this device can also be used as an impenetrable shield, capable of protecting facilities, vehicles, individuals, or even spacecraft from everything from ballistic missiles to coronal mass ejections. Dr. Pius's patents seem to indicate truly revolutionary technologies that would fundamentally change the human race, or at least America. However, many physicists note that these patents seem to completely violate the laws of physics as known, and don't lend these outlandish inventions any real credence. Despite this, Dr. Pius continues to receive the full support of the United States Navy. And as we mentioned before, leaked internal emails seem to indicate that at least one of these devices was successfully prototyped. Perhaps it's a shell game put on by the US military to throw potential adversaries like Russia and China off the trail of real technological breakthroughs. Or perhaps the United States military is about to completely revolutionize the state of mankind's technology. Only time will tell. It was seen by thousands of eyewitnesses, including the legendary Snake Plissken himself, but the Air Force says they were all wrong. Is it possible that thousands of eyewitnesses across the entire state of Arizona all misidentified a flight of A-10s in the world's largest UFO sighting in history? The incident was first reported at 7:55 p.m. Pacific Time in Henderson, Nevada, just across the border from Arizona. A witness there spotted what appeared to be a large, dark V-shaped object traveling southeast overhead. The object was low enough in the sky that the witness reported not hearing the sound of jet engines as would be expected. This flying anomaly had 6 large lights along its leading edge, and it was estimated as being as large as a Boeing 747. Instead of jet engines, though, he heard a sound described as rushing wind. Next, a police officer in Paulden, Arizona, spotted a cluster of 5 reddish-orangish lights as he was leaving his home. The police officer reported the lights appearing as if 4 were flying together, with a 5th trailing behind the formation. However, unlike the witness across the border in Nevada, the police officer reported that each light was in fact 2 separate but close-together sources of orange light. Returning home, he grabbed a pair of binoculars and observed the lights continuing south for about 2 minutes until they were out of sight. From his vantage point, he reported hearing no sounds from the lights. This would be the straw that broke the camel's back, as shortly after UFO reporting centers across the country, as well as local police departments and even Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, were flooded with telephone calls from eyewitnesses. It seemed everybody north of Phoenix was watching the lights slowly drift by overhead. Witnesses were reporting different things, however, with some reporting the same type and style of lights as the first 2 witnesses, and others reporting less or even more than the 5 or 6 lights originally observed. The colors ranged from white to orange or reddish, and while many reported the lights to be slowly gliding overhead, some said that they witnessed them speeding by quickly. Others said they observed the lights come to a complete stop overhead. The most commonly reported sighting, however, was of a large wedge-shaped craft of some kind with lights lining its ventral surface. 3 different groups of witnesses just north of Phoenix all reported the exact same object, remarking that it had made no noise as it seemed to glide by overhead, adjusting its course to fly between 2 mountain peaks. It was low enough, though, that for all 3 groups it blocked out a significant amount of the sky overhead as it passed by, indicating it was an object of massive proportions. The next witnesses were a mother and her 4 daughters inside a northern Phoenix suburb who observed a wedge-shaped object approach from over the mountains. It stopped directly overhead for an estimated 5 minutes as they stared in wonder, remarking that it was big enough to cover between 30 or 40 degrees of the sky overhead. They also said that there appeared to be some sort of barely recognizable features along the underside of the object, but due to it being nighttime, they couldn't make them out. The trailing edge of the object also seemed to be glowing slightly, according to them. Like other witnesses, they described a row of lights on the leading edge of the craft, 7, according to them. Suddenly, the object began moving south, firing what they described as a white beam at the ground. Simultaneously, the lights along the edge of the craft seemed to dim and disappear. Then the mystery object resumed its course south towards Sky Harbor International Airport. On approach to the airport, it was witnessed by a civilian pilot who called in 6 bright lights hanging stationary near the airport. Air traffic control radioed back that they had nothing on their radar scopes, and the pilot resumed landing as normal. That pilot was actually film star Kurt Russell, who was flying to Phoenix on a private aircraft to take his son to see his girlfriend. Russell would later retell the story, saying that he had no idea until 2 years later when his partner Goldie Hawn was watching a show on UFOs, and it mentioned a civilian pilot who had been the first to spot the lights in Phoenix itself. According to Russell, the lights hung stationary in the sky, and though he and his son thought it was odd, neither paid much attention to it. However, at the airport, 2 air traffic controllers and multiple pilots would also see the lights. But here's where things get murky. Witnesses in Scottsdale, Glendale, and Gilbert all reported seeing a similar large object, as described previously, continued an apparent southern route through the state of Arizona. One of the witnesses south of Phoenix was a former airline pilot with over 13,000 hours of flight time, who spotted the object making an abrupt turn as it approached his position. According to him and other eyewitnesses, the lights were bright at a distance but seemed to dim significantly as the object approached, perhaps explaining the various numbers and colors of lights reported throughout the 2 or 3 hour event. A large object continued south and over the mountains until it was spotted again along Interstate 10 near Casa Grande. A family of 5 driving north to Phoenix said the object was so large that when they looked out of their car windows, one wingtip was clearly visible out of one side of the car and the other out the other side. The object passed by overhead as they were driving north at about 80 miles per hour, and they claimed the object was so massive that they remained under it for about a full minute as it moved south. If their speed was correct, then the object was roughly an impressive 1.3 miles long, or even bigger as it was moving south as they moved north. However, without a speed estimate for the object itself, it's impossible to know, but that size is still significant. And all throughout the Phoenix area, the one massive object seemed to be trailing a flurry of other unidentified aerial phenomenon. For hours after the main object had passed over the state, witnesses reported seeing clusters of lights and other random flying craft. One group of witnesses reported a large disk streaking west over Phoenix at extreme speeds. Many others reported orange fireballs which hovered in the sky. The entire case's most intriguing witness might have been a young man claiming to be a U.S. Air Force airman. According to him, he was stationed at Luke Air Force Base west of Phoenix. He called the National UFO Reporting Center at 3:20 a.m. and reported that 2 F-15 fighters had been scrambled by the base to intercept one of the unidentified flying objects that seemed to linger behind. Investigators would dive into his report, but were unable to verify the presence of F-15s in Luke Air Force Base at the time. However, he provided a great deal of very detailed information regarding the alleged intercept, which would later be verified by other witnesses over the coming weeks and months as investigators made the rounds across the Phoenix Basin. Unfortunately, the airman would call in 2 days after his phone call to report that he had been informed he was being immediately transferred to a new assignment in frozen Greenland. That witness has never been heard from again, and investigators have been unable to track him down. What the incident is best remembered for, however, is a long string of lights observed by thousands directly over the city of Phoenix. The lights hung stationary before slowly disappearing, and they are what the entire incident is best known for. However, they're also the weakest part of the entire case. When first contacted, the Luke Air Force Base Public Affairs Office claimed that there was no aircraft in the sky at the time of the incident. Later, however, they said that there was actually a flight of A-10 aircraft training at the time, and their training included dropping flares. The slowly falling flares dangle from parachutes as they disappear behind the mountains and would have given the appearance of dimming out. Many found this explanation troubling, and there are problems on both ends of the explanation. However, all can agree that this doesn't explain the massive craft spotted by hundreds, if not thousands of witnesses across the state. One witness claims that he observed the alleged massive craft with a telescope and found it to be nothing more than a group of aircraft flying closely together. This goes in line with the official Air Force explanation that said at the time that they were undertaking Operation Snowbird, a training exercise with the Air National Guard that involved flights of A-10s working together. The first incident of a large flying triangle or wedge-shaped craft was at 8 p.m. local time, and it was due to 5 A-10s. The flight was using steady formation lights rather than the typical blinking collision lights because FAA rules on the matter don't apply to military aircraft. The formation of A-10s flew over Phoenix to Tucson and landed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base at 8:45 p.m. The stationary lights filmed and photographed by many hovering over Phoenix were explained as a different flight of A-10s dropping illumination flares. Due to the heat of the flares working on the parachute and creating a hot air balloon-like effect, the flare's rate of descent was dramatically slower than might be expected, given the appearance of the lights either gaining altitude or hovering still in midair. 10 years after the incident, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones, a Maryland Air National Guard pilot, confirmed that he was one of the pilots in the 4-ship formation that had dropped the mistaken flares. Immediately after the incident, as calls for investigation reached state government, Arizona Governor and former U.S. Air Force pilot Fife Symington held what would become the most infamous press conference in UFO history. In the press conference, Governor Symington displayed his chief of staff in handcuffs and dressed like an alien, claiming that everybody was entirely too serious about the whole incident. However, people did not find this funny at all, and the stunt provoked thousands of angry phone calls and letters. Even more shockingly, 10 years after that press conference, the former governor admitted in an interview that he himself had seen the craft spotted by the thousands. According to former Governor Symington, the craft he witnessed along with another family was bigger than an aircraft carrier and had the same recessed lights reported by others. It glided by on a southerly course, completely silent as it passed overhead. He chose, however, not to talk about it, likely because given his role as the state governor, he didn't want to create panic, but even more likely because of the culture of ridicule that persists to this day regarding UFOs. The official Air Force investigation does explain part of the phenomenon. It's very likely that the lights witnessed hovering stationarily over Phoenix were in fact nothing more than the flares dropped by A-10s. The astronomer who explained the moving formation of lights as aircraft flying closely together also is probably correct, as he likely observed A-10s flying together with solid formation lights on rather than traditional blinking collision warning lights. However, nobody has yet to satisfactorily explain the single massive craft reported by thousands of witnesses, including the governor of Arizona himself. While skeptics have explained this away as aircraft flying in formation, many of these witnesses, again including the governor, who was a trained Air Force pilot, specifically saw a single solid object and were close enough to remark that it made little to no noise as it passed overhead. A-10s are notoriously loud aircraft. A member of the infographic show team told us as he was once within very close proximity of a two-ship formation, dropping cluster munitions and making gun runs on targets. Skeptics have so far only been able to point at the flight of A-10s observed by some witnesses as explanation for the single large craft, but this completely ignores the thousands of eyewitnesses ranging from Nevada to New Mexico who spotted the craft for themselves. The skeptical explanation seems to rely on observations of the A-10s to explain this craft away, but ignores the possibility that both a flight of A-10s and a single large craft could have been flying over Arizona at the same time. It's also incredibly intellectually dishonest to simply disregard the testimony of thousands of eyewitnesses, including some extremely high-profile witnesses like the state's own governor. A skeptical explanation thus rests on the only possibility being that every single witness to the large craft is either incompetent, a liar, or crazy. However, the skeptical explanation makes one further major error. First, it takes the word of a single astronomer who said he observed multiple aircraft flying in close formation with his telescope, and yet it completely ignores the thousands of witnesses to the single solid craft. The astronomer didn't take a photo of the formation of the aircraft with his telescope. He has no proof that he actually made the observation, but skeptics accept his account without questioning it, while ignoring the tidal wave of countering accounts, because this is a conclusion the skeptic likes. This isn't skepticism, this is intellectual dishonesty for the sake of preserving one's own naturalistic worldview. True skepticism would accept that while some accounts were no doubt mistaking the flight of A-10s as one object, other accounts are much more difficult to explain and are worthy of their own investigation, like those accounts who were close enough to visually confirm the single object, and were well outside of the known flight path of the A-10s in question. What's a fact is that this isn't the only such sighting, as massive UFOs have been commonly reported around the world. During the Cold War, Soviet citizens reported massive UFOs overhead on numerous occasions. During the Belgium UFO flap, hundreds of witnesses spotted massive craft overhead in the sky, prompting fears of a Russian attack. And the sightings continue to this day, with mysterious lights appearing over San Diego and prompting what many would end up calling the Phoenix Lights 2.0. The Earth is being visited by non-human intelligences. That's the claim of infamous whistleblower David Grush. After a congressional hearing has left the nation and the world at large divided on the issue of UFOs, the topic has received more attention than ever, and disturbingly, a growing number of politicians and academics are calling for greater scrutiny of this strange phenomenon. These are the most credible UFO sightings in history so far. 1952. Operation Mainbrace. UFO concerns in America in the post-war period finally reached the United Kingdom in 1950, with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asking his Air Minister for a briefing on the topic of flying saucers. He was assured that there was nothing to worry about, and there was no credible evidence that these apparent alien craft were anything more than misidentification, hoaxes, or natural phenomenon. 2 years later, the British Ministry of Defense was forced to take back that statement. In 1952, NATO launched Exercise Mainbrace, a simulated invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union. What happened next would prompt Captain Edward Ruppelt, head of the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book, to comment that this incident finally prompted the RAF to officially recognize the UFO phenomenon. And recognize it they did, with the feverish investigation in the wake of the Mainbrace incidents prompting the CIA's Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence, Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, to write a classified memo titled British Activity in the Field of UFOs. In fall of 1952, 80,000 NATO personnel took part in a massive 12-day military exercise in waters off the coast of Norway and Denmark. The navies of the United States and the United Kingdom made up the bulk of the international coalition's power, and the exercise was meant as both a show of force to act as a deterrent to the Soviet Union and as a way to practice a response to an invasion of Western Europe by the Soviets. It was the biggest display of naval power in the region since World War I, and all personnel were on the lookout for Soviet surveillance aircraft and ships. But something else decided to come and check the exercise out. It all began on September 13th, when the crew on the Danish destroyer Villamos witnessed a strange triangular-shaped object moving at high speeds across the sky. It seemed to glow with a strange bluish light and was witnessed by the destroyer's captain, who estimated it to be moving at supersonic speeds. A week later, as the exercise progressed, the UFOs returned. On September 19th, a British Meteor fighter jet was returning to its airfield at Topcliffe, Yorkshire, at just prior to 11 a.m. In what would become known within British intelligence as the Yorkshire Incident, a group of senior British military leaders were gathered as the meteor came in for a landing. Suddenly, the men on the ground spotted a silvery disc-like metallic object following the meteor while moving back and forth as it did, swaying like a pendulum. The meteor canceled its landing and began to circle, trying to get a closer look at the object. On the ground, the British officers witnessed the object come to a complete standstill and hover silently, rotating slowly on its axis. When the meteor got too close, the disc suddenly shot off westward at incredible speed, making an abrupt course change and disappearing in the southeastern horizon. Dr. Chadwell would write a CIA memo on the incident, remarking how the object was seen by many high-ranking officials from the Royal Air Force, as well as civilian onlookers, prompting a newspaper to report on the incident, much to the dismay of the RAF. On September 20th, the crew aboard the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt aircraft carrier spotted a silvery spherical object that seemed to be following the fleet. The object was photographed by reporter Wallace Litwin, who took color photographs which were promptly seized by Navy intelligence. The photos were never made public, but Project Blue Book's chief, Captain Ruppelt, would later state that the photos were of excellent quality and clearly showed the object moving rapidly as it approached the fleet. Suspicions that the object was an errant weather balloon were dispelled in the post-incident investigation, with no ship having launched one that day. Later that evening, at Karup Field in Denmark, Danish Air Force officers spotted a shiny metallic disc flying overhead at about 7:30 p.m. The object appeared to be coming from the direction of the fleet out at sea and quickly disappeared into the clouds in the east. On September 21st, Royal Air Force pilots were returning to base and observed a shiny sphere approaching from the direction of the fleet at sea. The 6 aircraft immediately vectored in on the sphere and gave pursuit, with the sphere eluding them and disappearing. As the aircraft returned to base, one of the pilots looked behind them and spotted the sphere following closely behind. He immediately turned to give chase again, but the sphere turned as well and quickly accelerated out of sight. The main brace sightings were never explained and couldn't be chalked up to visual anomalies or weather events, as they were verified by personnel across the NATO alliance. The incident shook the British intelligence services to the core, scaring them enough to reopen an investigation into the UFO phenomenon. A month later, though, another incident much closer to home would rattle the UK military. On October 21, 1952, Flight Lieutenant Michael Swinney, a pilot instructor, was taking his new student, Royal Navy Lieutenant David Crofts, up for a training flight. The jet took off without incident and headed up into a thick cloud bank. As the jet punched through the clouds at an elevation of 15,000 feet, the men got the fright of their lives. Directly ahead of them were 3 nearly white circular objects. 2 were on a level keel with the third slightly on its side. Swinney's first instinct was to grab control of the jet and bank away, believing that they were heading straight for 3 men parachuting down. As they leveled out, though, the 2 aviators got a clear look at what exactly had been waiting for them. In an interview, Swinney described the objects as the typically reported saucers, but mentioned that as they climbed above them, they realized that they were very flat. The craft were hovering perfectly still, but when the meteor flew above them, they moved from one side of the plane to the other in a rapid, sudden movement. Leveling out at 35,000 feet, Swinney and Crofts looked down at the craft from above, noting that the craft seemed to give off a slightly fuzzy or iridescent light along the edges. The craft appeared to be completely solid, with no windows, portholes, or any visible signs of propulsion. Swinney was so disturbed by the sighting that he checked to make sure his oxygen was flowing correctly, even asking Crofts to verify that the oxygen system was indeed working. Crofts, who would verify Swinney's story decades later, commented on Swinney's disbelief at what he was seeing. Crofts suggested that they go after the UFOs as they began to move away. However, Swinney shot the idea down, remarking on an incident reported from the west coast of the US where 2 pilots went after a UFO and disappeared, with the rumor being that they were vaporized by the object they were chasing. Swinney planned to cancel the exercise and return to base, but radioed his sighting in before doing so. The radio call caused pandemonium on the ground, as most personnel had heard rumors of UFOs but disregarded the phenomenon. The fact that one of their own instructors was calling in a sighting, however, rattled the crew on the ground, with air traffic control ordering Swinney to approach the UFOs to get a better look. Reluctantly, Swinney turned his meteor toward the craft, accelerating to Mach 0.8. As the meteor neared the craft, though, they appeared to simply disappear. Swinney and Crofts both commented that as they approached, they would look at the craft to keep themselves oriented and then look away to clear their vision. Upon looking back, though, the objects had simply disappeared. Altogether, though, Swinney and Crofts had kept the objects under observation for 10 minutes. What the 2 pilots couldn't know, though, is that miles away, the UFOs were causing even more panic within the RAF. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the UFOs had been tracked on radar at Little Rissington, who had called the HQ Fighter Command at Stanmore to report the track. With fears of a surprise Soviet attack rampant, military officers immediately ordered an air defense alert. A ground-controlled interception radar at RAF Sopley began tracking unidentified aircraft moving rapidly across southwest England. Sopley's commanding officer contacted the COO at RAF Southern Sector, and orders to scramble interceptors were issued. A pair of meteors on quick reaction alert were in the sky in minutes, being vectored toward the unidentified craft by Sopley. Back at RAF Southern Sector, senior officers watched on a plot as the incoming meteors approached the unidentified craft, which suddenly accelerated to an estimated 1,000 miles per hour. The meteors throttled up as much as they could and followed the craft, but were unable to keep up. The main brace incidents would be a wake-up call to the NATO alliance and launched reinvigorated interest from the Western world in the UFO phenomenon. 2004 USS Nimitz sightings. This UFO incident would remain classified for years until footage captured by the pilots involved was leaked to the public. To the surprise of everyone, the Navy quickly admitted that the footage was not a hoax, it was genuine. The Nimitz incident would be the catalyst of a renewed interest in UFOs by the general public and herald a seismic shift amongst the highest levels of power in America over how the topic was handled. It all started on November 14, 2004, 100 miles southwest of San Diego, California. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was undertaking a series of drills before a pending deployment to the Persian Gulf. At 2 p.m., two F-18 Super Hornets were on a routine training flight when they got a live tasking from the USS Princeton. The Princeton had received a radar upgrade and, unbeknownst to the pilots, had been tracking mysterious objects, performing erratic maneuvers for days. The objects would descend from 80,000 feet to sea level in about a second and display incredible feats of speed and maneuverability. According to Kevin Day, Princeton's senior radar operator on the day of the incident, they had tracked over 100 unknown objects over the last 7 days, remarking that sometimes there were so many that watching them on the radar display, quote, was like watching snow fall from the sky. Now, those objects were back, and with a training flight in the air, there was a chance to finally get eyes on and figure out if the objects were real or confirm that the Princeton's very expensive new radar was a complete dud. An operations officer aboard the Princeton ordered the Super Hornets to vector in on the locations of the objects, ominously asking if the pilots were carrying any live ordnance. They were not. Arriving at the last tracked location of the objects, flight leader and squadron commander, Commander David Fravor, remarked that there was nothing to be seen until he spotted a strange disturbance in the ocean below them. Something was causing the water to churn with waves breaking over what appeared to be a very large object under the surface. Later, it would be theorized that the Super Hornets actually spotted the nuclear attack submarine that typically accompanies a U.S. carrier strike group. What got their attention next, though, was an object hovering motionless not very far away, approximately 50 feet off the water. Fravor estimated the object to be about 40 feet long, shaped like a tic-tac, and with no wings, engine, or visible means of propulsion. The object would hover still and then make erratic and sudden dashes over the ocean, reminding Fravor of throwing a ping-pong ball against the wall. Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, Fravor's wingwoman, stayed up top as Fravor descended his aircraft to get a closer look. She would later remark feeling terrified watching the craft make erratic and extremely high-G maneuvers, wondering how she'd be able to fight this thing if it turned hostile. As Fravor descended, the tic-tac seemed to take note of him and began to rise in an opposing circular swoop to Fravor, mirroring him but in reverse. Suddenly, Fravor pitched his nose toward the object in an attempt to cut it off in an aggressive maneuver. And that's when the object seemed to respond to the challenge with a game of chicken, rapidly accelerating at Fravor and flying straight across his nose. With the object gone, the operations officer on the Princeton ordered them to head to a predetermined rendezvous point 60 miles away. As they were en route, the Princeton suddenly radioed in, having picked up the tic-tac object again on its radar. To everyone's astonishment, the object was waiting for the Super Hornets right at their rendezvous point, having gotten there in less than a minute. It was almost like it was taunting them. Fravor and Dietrich were forced to return to the Nimitz, but another pair of Super Hornets would catch up to the UFO, filming the now infamous tic-tac video. Skeptics would claim that the entire USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group had simply misidentified a distant passenger jet, which if true would mean that the US Navy has reached Russian levels of utter incompetence. Others, like science educator and celebrity Neil deGrasse Tyson, would mock the incident, commenting on how UFOs always appear blurry, without realizing that the entire footage, including the HUD markings, are also blurry because it's been reduced in resolution, as the military typically does with footage from sensitive sensor platforms before public release. The Nimitz incident would highlight a peculiar trait of skepticism. We trust our combat aviators with the defense of $1.2 billion aircraft carriers, but not when they report anomalous craft, even if the U.S. Navy itself supports their claim. 1973. Pascagoula Abduction, Mississippi. Alien abduction reports are not uncommon, and most have been disproven as either hoaxes or strange phenomenon such as sleep paralysis. However, one police officer's attempt to debunk a sensational abduction report would end up giving the world incredible evidence that the victims were telling the truth. On the evening of October 11, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker Jr. got off work and decided to do a bit of night fishing. The two were casting their lines when shortly after sunset they noticed a pair of blue lights flashing in the water. Looking up, they spotted a blue light about 2 to 3 miles away, moving in their direction. With shocking speed, it descended on the bayou and appeared in front of the men, coming to a stop 2 to 3 feet off the ground, about 25 yards from the stunned men. The light turned out to be coming from a large oblong-shaped craft that seemed to give off an odd whirring or whizzing sound as it moved until coming to a stop. Hickson turned to head toward the river, but before he had a chance to get very far, an opening suddenly appeared in the strange craft. 3 beings floated out of the craft toward him and Parker. The beings appeared to be wearing a skin-tight bluish suit of some kind and hovered slightly over the ground. Instead of hands, they had claw-like appendages and a bullet-shaped head with no neck that seemed to sit right atop their torso. Hickson estimated the creatures were just under 6 feet tall. The creatures did not speak, but one made a buzzing noise from time to time while the other 2 remained completely silent. Parker was terrified and at some point lost consciousness, but both he and Hickson appeared to be unable to move their bodies. 2 of the creatures floated behind Hickson and gently picked him up by his arms with their pincers, effortlessly lifting him off the ground. In a later police interview, he would claim that the creatures did not use force and he never felt a sensation of pain. They simply seemed to steer him where they wanted him to go. The creatures lifted Hickson into the craft, where he lost sight of the unconscious Parker. Inside the craft, Hickson was left floating and turned from time to time as a machine that he struggled to describe appeared to be used to inspect him. While doing his best to recall the experience, he described the machine as a giant eye with an attachment on it, and it seemed to scan his entire body. Once the apparent scan was complete, the creatures left him floating, again with no sensation of pain or discomfort. Hickson would later claim that he simply didn't feel anything except inner terror. Inside the room he was left in, there was no machinery or furniture of any kind, and the walls glowed with very bright white light. After an estimated 20 to 30 minutes, the creatures returned and laid him on his chest again. Hickson attempted to speak with the creatures, but the only response was a buzzing sound from the creature who was buzzing before. The next thing Hickson remembers is standing outside the ship with Parker, who seemed frozen in terror. The ship was gone, and Hickson struggled to get Parker to come to. The 2 men initially decided to keep quiet about their experience, but then Hickson suggested they call the nearby Kessler Air Force Base, who informed him to contact the sheriff. Instead, the 2 went to a local newspaper, but there were no reporters present, and only then they decided to head to the sheriff to report their abduction. Hickson admitted that he didn't expect to be believed, but he still felt like he had to tell the authorities. The sheriff conducted a brief interview, but was convinced the men were lying. To prove they were lying, he left the hidden tape recorder running and left the interrogation room for a few minutes, hoping to catch the 2 in the act of discussing their hoax. Instead, he captured more proof that if anything, the 2 men believed they'd really been abducted. The tape recorder captured the 2 men in a state of panic. Parker stated that he had to get home or see a doctor to help him calm down, and Hickson stated that he needed a drink to calm his own nerves. Parker had passed out from terror and admitted as such. Thus, his recollection was not as detailed as Hickson's, but he did comment about the initial paralyzation effect and being unable to move. The men discussed the door opening on the side of the ship and the creatures coming out of it. Hickson warned that nobody would believe them, then stated, quote, "They won't believe it. They're gonna believe it one of these days. Might be too late. I knew all along there was people from other worlds up there. I knew all along. I never thought it would happen to me." Hickson became agitated at this point, stating he needed to get home and get himself a stiff drink to help him sleep. He left the room, and the last thing the tape recorder captured before the sheriff returned was Parker alone in the room stating, quote, "It's hard to believe. Oh God, it's awful. I know there's a God up there." And then Parker began praying in a low tone. There were no other witnesses to the Pascagoula abduction, and Hickson refused to take a polygraph test concerning the event. Hickson's initial story also changed some of the details over time, whether due to embellishments or memory remains unknown. One skeptic would claim that Hickson had fantasized the entire encounter during a waking dream state, with Parker going along with it due to suggestibility caused by his loss of consciousness. Hickson would go on to tell his own story on 4 TV programs, and both would conduct various interviews. Years later, Parker would start a TV production company to produce shows related to UFOs and released a book late in his life recounting his abduction. The two men have given considerable fodder for skeptics to tear holes in their story, but nobody has yet to account for the behavior of the men when they were not aware that they were being recorded. The original secret recording was meant to bust the hoax wide open and instead showed 2 men desperately terrified and in a near state of panic. Then, 45 years after the event, another witness came forward, told by her family to remain quiet for decades so as to not draw attention to herself. Maria Blair decided to come forward to help corroborate the men's story at last. On that same night, Blair had driven her husband to the bayou so he could take a boat to work offshore. As the two waited for the captain in their parked car, her husband went to sleep. Shortly after dark, Blair spotted a blue light lifting up off the ground on the opposite riverbank and heading straight up into the sky. Blair didn't think much of the incident until the next day when news of the abduction broke, and she realized she'd witnessed the craft after it had taken the men. She wanted to come forward, but her husband warned her for years after the event not to speak of a word of it to anyone, as she would be ridiculed for it. Blair could have simply been latching onto the case after the fact, with her husband playing a supporting role. Ultimately, the truth of what really happened that night is unknown. All we know is that a secret tape recording collected strong proof that whatever happened, Hickson and Parker at least believed they had been abducted by aliens. 1967, Falcon Lake Incident, Canada. While Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker only have a story and a compelling secret recording to back their claims, one UFO encounter left physical evidence of its existence, seared onto the flesh of its victim. It would come to be known as one of Canada's biggest UFO cases, so big in fact that it was investigated by agencies on both sides of the border. The victim, Stephen McCalloch, would go on to wish he'd never spoken about the incident, even as it forced him to seek treatment at the world-renowned Mayo Clinic for the mysterious lasting effects. It all began on May 20th, 1967, with McCalloch, a former military policeman in the Polish military, venturing in the wilderness of Falcon Lake. An amateur geologist, McCalloch liked to prospect for quartz and silver and had staked a few claims in the area. On this long weekend, he set out to look for where he might stake more claims and do a bit of exploring. At some point during his hike, the 51-year-old McCalloch was startled by a flight of geese erupting in honks. Looking up to see what had startled the birds, McCalloch spotted 2 cigar-shaped objects with a reddish glow hovering just 45 meters away. As he watched, one of the objects descended onto a large flat outcropping of rock, changing its shape to appear more disc-like as it did. The other remained hovering in the air above it for a few minutes and then left. McCalloch immediately assumed he'd stumbled across secret U.S. test aircraft. He sat on a rock for the next 30 minutes and sketched what he saw. After finishing his sketch, he decided to approach the craft, wondering if perhaps the pilots had experienced some kind of trouble and might need help. As he approached, the air grew very warm and the craft seemed to give off a strong smell of sulfur. Unlike other UFO encounters, McCalloch reported hearing a sound like whirring motors and the hiss of air, prompting him to believe he was indeed looking at a secret U.S. aircraft and not an alien one. Getting closer, he noticed an open door on the side of the craft with very bright lights inside. He also heard multiple voices speaking inside the craft, but the noise of it muffled the conversation and made it impossible to make out the details. McCalloch then called to the craft, offering the quote Yankee boys help if they needed any. The voices immediately went quiet, but did not respond. He then tried Polish, Russian, and finally German, but nobody responded. At this point, McCalloch drew closer and noticed that the metal of the craft appeared perfectly smooth, with no seams, joints, or connecting bolts of any kind visible. He was forced to put on the welding goggles that he used to protect his eyes while chipping rocks, so he could look inside through the bright light coming out. Inside, he saw various light beams and panels of flashing lights, but couldn't see anyone inside the strange craft. Suddenly, as McCalloch took a step back, 3 panels slid across the opening and sealed it. Reaching out to touch the craft, the moment he made contact with the metal, the heat of the craft melted the fingertips of his leather glove. Then the craft began to slowly turn counterclockwise until a panel with a grid of holes was aimed directly at him. A blast of superheated gas struck McCalloch and knocked him over, setting his shirt and cap on fire and forcing him to tear them off. The craft then lifted off and flew away. Nauseous and disoriented, the shirtless McCalloch stumbled his way out of the forest and to his hotel room. Then he took a bus and caught a ride back to Winnipeg, where he was treated for burns on his chest and stomach. The burns would turn into raised sores in a perfect grid-like pattern, as described on the craft by McCalloch. As McCalloch's story spread, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the U.S. Air Force, and various other government agencies launched an investigation. Investigators backtracked McCalloch's journey and found the site of the incident, where they recovered the melted glove he had torn off his hand, as well as his burned shirt and the tools he left behind. Later analysis of the burns would frustrate those trying to identify what could have caused the grid-like pattern. Also at the site was a 15-foot diameter circle that had been cleared completely of moss and other vegetation. Soil samples from the circle as well as McCalloch's clothing were tested and discovered to be radioactive. A year later, another investigation discovered bits of metal which appeared to have been melted into the cracks between rocks in the alleged landing site. When tested, this metal too was found to be radioactive and remains so to this day. McCalloch himself would remain sick after the event, with the burns recurring on his chest up to a year after the incident. Suffering from nausea and blackouts, McCalloch was referred to the Mayo Clinic, with doctors unable to diagnose his illness. A psychiatrist that analyzed McCalloch, though, found him to be very down-to-earth and unlikely to invent wild fantasies. The incident has never been explained, though the initial investigation by the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book found it inconclusive. Investigators from Project Blue Book noted that McCalloch was unable to guide them back to the site of the incident, with one suspecting that he was stalling on purpose. However, an air search was able to locate the alleged landing site, and there was never an explanation given for the 15-foot burned circle of vegetation, nor the superheated metal discovered a year later wedged into cracks in the rocks. Investigators were unable to explain the source of McCalloch's burns on his body, clothing, and melted glove. The radioactivity measured, though, was believed to have come from a nearby radium vein that was discovered near the site. Skeptics would point to McCalloch's claims of not having anything to drink being disputed by a bartender at the hotel that he was staying at, who stated that McCalloch had drank 5 bottles of beer the night before. McCalloch also differed on his take on the conversation he had with the police officer, G.A. Solotki, with Solotki noting the differences in his own report, as well as the burns on McCalloch's body and possible inebriation. Skeptics would also claim that McCalloch had likely made up the entire event to dissuade others from exploring any of his mining claims. However, beer does not stay in your system for nearly 24 hours, and none of the search parties found any evidence of heavy drinking by McCalloch in the area. Further, there was no evidence of any sort of fire that McCalloch might have had a drunk accident with, only to blame it on a UFO, as skeptics claim. The suspicion of being inebriated was likely simply due to the very nauseous state, physical exhaustion, and the pain that McCalloch was in, as verified by the hospital staff who treated him. Further, skeptics claim that McCalloch's recurring grid-like burn marks were caused by an allergic reaction, despite McCalloch having never such a reaction before or again in his life after the final appearance of the burns a year later. McCalloch's own family attests that he has never suffered any similar allergic reaction before. No explanation for the molten metal or the 15-foot circle of burned vegetation has been offered. In the summer of 1952, a series of strange sightings took place in Washington, D.C. From July 19th to July 27th, authorities were inundated with reports of unexplained objects in the sky and extraterrestrial craft. The people observing these unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, weren't just ordinary citizens. Air traffic controllers and pilots were among the first to detect strange craft, and even stranger phenomena, ranging from weird white glows to orange balls of fire, repeatedly over those few weeks. These events panicked everyone from local DC citizens all the way up to President Harry Truman, who called the Air Force to demand an explanation for what was occurring. Was Washington, D.C. truly experiencing an alien invasion? Imagine you're a reporter working at the Washington Post in 1952. You're a journalist reporting on breaking news and current events for one of the most prestigious publications in the country, and you're still blissfully unaware of what terms like clickbait and BuzzFeed mean, and how they will ruin your entire profession. On Saturday, July 19th, just before midnight, you get a tip that air traffic controller Edward Nugent has spotted 7 suspicious blips on his radar, located 15 miles south-southwest of the city. It can't be a cause of human error, as his superior senior air traffic controller Harry Barnes saw and confirmed the objects on the radar scope himself. Nugent started the night by joking about the fleet of flying saucers that seemed to be on the screen. Soon, however, he sees the unidentified object streaking by near the White House and Capitol building. The situation now seems to be less of a joke and more of a national security threat situation. The controllers desperately trying to confirm what the blips could be, but there are no known aircraft in the vicinity of the objects on the radar, and the objects aren't following any known flight paths. Barnes adds an even stranger observation, confiding in you. We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. Perhaps it's a machine malfunction, you wonder. After all, there has to be some kind of reasonable explanation. Barnes insists that's impossible. Two controllers double-checked the Nugent's radar and found it to be in perfect working order. Furthermore, Barnes called yet another two controllers in a separate tower of the National Airport who also saw 7 unidentified objects moving erratically on their screen. Or, as one of the controllers, Howard Coughlin, succinctly put it, "Did you see that? What in the hell was that?" Coughlin and his co-worker Joe Zacco, yeah, that's his real name, also report seeing an incredibly bright white light zoom away at top speed, not on the radar, with their own eyes. At that moment, Barnes suddenly stops talking, stunned. UFOs are multiplying all over the radar scope, converging over the White House and Capitol. There's a heightened sense of urgency as the UFOs approach high-value targets. Andrews Air Force Base, around 10 miles away from the National Airport, confirms that the strange objects have appeared on their radar as well. You call the base to hear that Airman William Brady also personally witnessed an object like an orange ball of fire with a tail that took off at unbelievable speed. What are these erratic balls of light doing? And how are they moving at more than hypersonic speeds? Are they the objects showing up on the radar? Later in the night, you get confirmation that the balls of light are exactly what the radar is detecting. Capital Airlines pilot S.C. Pierman, waiting on the runway for permission to take off, spots what he believes to be a meteor, but then spots a series of white, tailless, fast-moving lights, 6 in total, over a 14-minute period. Those can't be meteors. He's in communication with Barnes, who confirms that the objects on radar correspond with the appearance and direction of the lights Pierman is seeing. Some of those observing the lights are convinced that they're stars and meteors. In fact, they're even able to prove it for a few of the lights spotted, though not all. This must be the explanation, you think. Perhaps it was an especially active night for meteor showers. However, that doesn't line up with the behavior and the speed of the lights seen in person. Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport at Andrews Air Force Base cited an orange-red ball that would appear to stand still and then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. You know, no meteor in the universe moves like that. Barnes sends you a tip, his last communication of the night. He thinks whatever the lights are, they're aware they're being watched. That's right, he's actually sitting here telling you the lights are sentient. Why does he think this is? Well, earlier that night, 2 F-94 Starfire jet fighters deployed from Delaware to try to get a closer look at the phenomenon. The pilots flew all over DC searching for the lights, but it's all in vain. The creepy lights that have baffled the city have disappeared. Realizing they're running low on fuel, the pilots head unwillingly back to base, at which point the lights mysteriously reappear. Barnes's conclusion is at once logical and frightening. The UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaving accordingly. You note the last sighting of the UFOs, 5:30 a.m. Still no closer to an explanation as to what might be happening to cause these increasingly strange phenomena. You make a mental note to communicate with the Air Force Base tomorrow and see if they have any ideas. The next day you wake up to see the most exaggerated headlines you can imagine. Saucers swarm over Capitol, according to the Cedar Rapids Gazette. You write a much more nuanced article explaining the events of last night to the public and exploring possible theories, admittedly none of which sound that convincing even to you, but an alien invasion seems too far-fetched a story to run with at this time. On Monday, July 21st, you get a call from U.S. Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. He announces himself as the supervisor of the Air Force's Project Blue Book research into UFO sightings. Frustrated by the fact that he only learned of the sightings from your article 2 days later, he's now seething at the Pentagon's lack of support as he tries to obtain a staff car to drive around Washington, D.C. and investigate the sightings. You ask him if, between his dealings with the Air Force and the Pentagon, if he has any idea what might have happened. Ruppelt says that Air Force radar specialist Captain Roy James thought unusual weather conditions might have occurred. What kind of weather creates orange balls of fire streaking through the sky at lightning speeds, you wonder? The rest of the week passes by mostly uneventfully. You're working late in the office again on Saturday, July 26th because you really need a life. And you suddenly notice another call from the National Airport has come in. Finally, perhaps they've finally figured out some sort of terrestrial explanation. Instead, the night's about to take an even stranger turn. The man on the other end of the line sounds disturbed. At around 8:15 p.m., a pilot and a flight attendant on National Airlines flight in the air observed some strange lights above the plane. Within seconds, unidentified objects similar to those a week ago suddenly appeared on the radar screen at National Airport and Andrews Base. At the base, USAF Master Sergeant Charles E. Cummings frustratedly denies any theories by those around him that these might be natural phenomena. Later, to an inquiring press, he would state, "These lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There was no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I have ever seen." You decide you need to be where the action is this time, and you head right over to the National Airport and are granted access to the control rooms with the radar screens. The press spokesman for Project Blue Book, Albert M. Chop, also decides he has to arrive on the scene himself to get a better idea of what's happening. It's now 9:30 p.m. and everyone's preparing for a night of chaos just like the Saturday before. The UFOs don't disappoint. The visuals on the radar screen are astounding. Unknown objects are showing up in every single sector of the screen. No one knows what to make of the situation. Sometimes the object travels slowly, other times they reverse course, and at times they move at speeds calculated to be up to 7,000 miles per hour. Since it's 1952, you don't know this yet, but that speed record won't be reached by humans until 2010, when NASA's X-43A scramjet hit speeds of Mach 9.6, just under 7,000 miles per hour. There is no man-made object in the world that can fly that fast in a world where I Love Lucy has just wrapped up its first season. In fact, sound itself only moves at 767 miles per hour. The atmosphere in the room is one of extreme confusion. In an attempt to get a better look at the lights, the Air Force decides to scramble two F-94 Starfire jet fighters one more time from Delaware. Captain John McHugo attempts to approach the radar blips but sees absolutely nothing. The other pilot, Lieutenant William Patterson, has better luck. While flying over Washington, Patterson identifies 4 white glows. He then starts to chase them, but eventually reaches his maximum speed and realizes he doesn't have a shot at catching up to the glowing UFOs. However, it appears he might not need to catch up to them after all, because suddenly Patterson looks around and realizes he is surrounded by the glows. He quickly informs ground control, "I see them now and they're all around me. What should I do?" You look around the room to see who's going to answer Patterson's command. After a few tense moments of everyone staring at each other, ground control responds with absolutely nothing. Because truly, no one on the ground has any idea what to do. A week after the original bizarre UFO sightings, the objects have come back. How is this possible? And why are they showing up on a Saturday again and again at the nation's capital? Is flying over Washington, D.C. and terrifying locals some kind of bizarre weekend road trip for these aliens? The situation has escalated to the point where it now has alarmed the President of the United States himself, Harry Truman. The entire U.S. has caught UFO fever, and people are calling the events of the past couple weeks the Big Flap, because the 50s were a boring time for naming things. In an attempt to understand what's happening in his country, Truman has his Air Force aide called Ruppelt, the aforementioned supervisor of Project Blue Book. He listens in on the two men's conversation without interrupting. Ruppelt's best theory at the moment? A temperature inversion made radar signals bend and show irregularities on the screen. The inversion occurs when a layer of warm air forms in the lower atmosphere, trapping the cool air beneath. This can cause radar to bounce off this low layer and show objects that are near the ground as appearing high up in the sky instead. However, Ruppelt himself admits he has not yet interviewed any witnesses or investigated the security issue in depth. How can a temperature inversion explain several eyewitness accounts, including those of Air Force personnel, control tower employees, and pilots, which all corroborate each other, as well as the blips on the radar? As a responsible journalist, you know you owe it to your readers to put forth another account of this weekend's events, as well as the possible explanation, even though it makes little sense. You decide to give your readers a little hope for a future explanation by including the fact that the CIA would be working alongside the Office of Scientific Intelligence and the Office of Current Intelligence to review the two weekend's events and monitor any future developments. On July 29th, Air Force Major General John Sanford, along with U.S. Air Force Director of Operations Roger Ramey, hold a press conference with representatives from almost every newspaper in the U.S. in attendance. When people with such long official-sounding titles are stepping up to talk, you know the situation is serious. The room is absolutely packed. It is the most well-attended press conference held by the Pentagon since World War II. Everyone is looking for answers. The Air Force insists the most likely explanation is a combination of misidentified stars or meteors to explain in-person sightings and temperature inversion explaining the numerous radar blips. Reports did confirm that a temperature inversion phenomena was present the nights the UFOs were seen on the radar. Stanford reassured the press that since the observed blips did not seem to be solid material objects, they did not pose a threat to national security. Some eyewitness accounts actually seem to reinforce the Air Force's explanation. The entire crew of a B-25 bomber flying over Washington had been told they were surrounded by these strange radar blips, but never saw anything to confirm an actual object. The same thing happened with an Eastern Airlines flight. Others remained unconvinced, including most of the radar and control tower personnel who observed the UFOs. They insisted that the repeated strange phenomena over a period of hours that multiple people witnessed could not simply have been misidentified meteors and temperature inversion. Ruppelt himself, standing next to you, tells you that he doesn't believe the original temperature inversion theory anymore and trusts his colleagues' eyewitness accounts instead over this government theory. During the conference, you notice that Samford keeps dodging questions regarding specific eyewitness accounts. It looks to you like he doesn't have much of an answer for these questions. Collecting all the data and stories, you publish both the Air Force account and the contradicting eyewitness accounts, completely lost as to which conclusion to draw. You decide to let readers sort through the facts and draw a conclusion themselves. As life goes on, you check in on developments relating to that July in 1952 from time to time. And years later, the Air Force's explanation would be more critically examined. Two knowledgeable men on the topic came out strongly in favor of the official explanation. Harvard astronomer Dr. Donald Menzel believed most of the in-person sightings were the result of a mirage effect, partly thanks to the strange atmospheric conditions those nights. Philip Klass, the senior editor of Aviation Week magazine, also pointed out that radar technology in 1952 was relatively primitive. The radar scope would have had trouble differentiating common objects such as weather balloons, birds, or temperature inversion from UFOs. He also threw some shade at the controllers on duty that night, stating that perhaps we had two dumb controllers at the National Airport on those nights. Burn. However, as to Klass's less offensive point regarding radar technology, he brings up the logical argument that UFO sightings on radar have rapidly declined after digital filters were introduced in the 70s. Or perhaps the aliens operating those UFOs took one look at 70s fashion and decided there's no need to visit the Earth again. One day, you hear from a surprising person regarding the UFO case. It's Faith McClory, the daughter of Captain Pierman, the National Airlines pilot who saw the white-bluish lights with his own eyes. McClory insists, as did her father, that what he saw that night could not have been weather-related. She is disgusted by what she sees as a government attempt to deflect real questions about the events of 1952. Her stance is clear. I don't want to use the words cover-up, but it was very clear he saw it. Everything was seen on radar. The truth is, we may never know what occurred those strange summer nights in Washington, D.C. But while waiting on the next alien invasion, make sure to pass the time by clicking on this video here, or this one.